Hello, Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be episode 256 of our regular shows, and we're recording this one on January 28th, 2023. This is the official podcast for the fan site Avatar The Last Airbender Online.com, and I am going to be your main host, Morgan Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So on today's show, we have a small little bit of news. There's really not that much since the last time we did a podcast. And then we'll be getting back into our re-reviews for both Avatar and Korra. And today we're going to be doing 3 episodes. So we're going to be doing from Avatar 119 and 120. So Siege of the North Part 1 and Part 2 to wrap up Book 1. And then we'll be starting with Legend of Korra, Book 2 Spirit, with Episode 1, Rebel Spirit. So some really good episodes here, and we'll get into them relatively shortly, like I said, because there's not much news. So getting into the little news that there is, Avatar News, who's been most of the news these past couple of months, did put out one sort of notable thing in the last few weeks, and that was just an exclusive that he put up saying that Avatar Studios and Netflix are collaborating on the live action series. His headline specifically also adds that, which will include new canon material contributed by Avatar Studios. Now, if you actually go through the post, it's maybe not as kind of wild and extreme as it maybe comes across, but for people who maybe thought there was a bit of a rift between, like, I suppose, Mike and Brian and Netflix, and if that carried over to Avatar Studios, this is just showing that that's probably nowhere near as big of a deal as you actually think, especially because Avatar Studios is more than Mike and Brian. So it just goes over a lot of the stuff like we knew from before. Like, I think we always knew that when Deneg, that VFX studio, they had like a thing that mentioned Avatar Studios, so we knew there was going to be some connection, and it just covers a lot of like sort of symbols and stuff like that are being the big thing that prompts the whole new canon material is that he says that the live action show includes new Avatar Studios canon that, at the time of writing and filming, wasn't released yet. For example, specifically, I have confirmation that a certain new piece of canon info was already in the live action script at the start of filming in November/December 2021 that was then revealed to be Avatar Studios canon in Avatar Studios release the next year in 2022. And then he just speculates that because of that, it likely means that more things like that can actually happen. So make of this one what you will. I just think it means that, sure, Avatar Studios, I guess Paramount over that, is considering the Netflix Avatar sort of under the same kind of umbrella. It's not this completely separate thing that Avatar Studios doesn't care about. There's some assistance going on between it, which I think makes sense. But Greg, what are your thoughts on this piece of news?
Yeah, I'm not surprised either. Like, none of these productions are in like some sort of vacuum where they like, completely are isolated from the other. Like, regardless of if, one or the other, like, people are going to compare or people are going to associate them with each other, even if they have completely different, production companies behind them. And Avatar Studios being, basically created to sort of push everything Avatar forward, would have some say in it. And, the overall license is still held by, Viacom, Paramount, Nickelodeon Studios and all of that. So, there's always going to be a connection there regardless. It's just how much are they putting into it, and it seems from what we've heard that there is more to it than what we would have thought. And they were originally on the team directly working with this production, so it's not like they were not involved with it to begin with. So it's not really too surprising. I think part of it might just be sort of just from us in the fandom, knowing the whole sort of original sort of rift that happened and everything, maybe taking some things out of proportion to the way that they really are. But no, it's cool that there's more stuff that's going to be in there, and that is going to potentially work all well together. So I think that's good for the end result regardless.
And then specifically the example, he doesn't obviously give what the example is, but I think people basically told me that what this is, what he's referring to here, I think because he mentioned it on his Patreon or something like that, is this certain new piece of canon information is literally the name Wolf Cove as being the name of the area in the Southern Water Tribe that basically like the show starts. That is what was in the script back when they were filming, and obviously we, for the first time officially, only heard about this from the Avatar Legends role-playing game. It's in the book as like the name of that place. Like, whoa, oh, that's the name of the capital. Like, incredible that we only knew that sort of now. Now, you obviously get into the idea that Wolf Cove is now actually being used in quite a few things. It's in the Avatar Generations game as well. So it's obviously just a piece of information that across the board with Avatar Studios is being used kind of everywhere. And then we don't really know internally like what the origin of it necessarily was. Like you mentioned, like, was this in Mike and Brian, like, whatever they supplied when they were still working on the show and it just continued on? Was that name brought into canon specifically for the books, but they felt it could be used in the other production as well? And you can see it's being spread around because, you know, I guess with game development as well, it's probably actually possible that Wolf Cove was maybe in the game before anything else as well. So, and then there's obviously the idea that we don't know what information is in like the series like Bible type thing that like we've never seen, that like they maybe hadn't revealed before. So, some of this is very kind of like speculative to just make the connection that just because like they used a name a couple of months before the book came out that had that name, that's what it like fully kind of means. But you know, it's an interesting one because obviously we know like Avatar Korra, for instance, is going to be in the Netflix show, and they're going to, I think, use more of the content with him in different places. They're using the other stuff that's there. I'm not sure if we can necessarily, you know, full on be like new canon material in the show, beyond like place names. Like there's a difference between sort of basically plot points and just like the odd place name or two. But anyway, it's still something, and that's kind of been what's happening, I suppose in the fandom for most of this month. It's been a lot of sort of speculating, will the first tease, the first look at the Netflix show happen now at this event, now at this stream? Everyone is just speculating on it. No one knows for sure, because it seems like the kind of insider rumors and stuff like that are suggesting the show will release in the summer, which means they're going to have to start marketing at some point in the next few months. And there's speculation that like, oh, will it be the Super Bowl they show something at? But apparently it's maybe been confirmed it's not happening at the Super Bowl, but we don't know for sure. What are your thoughts on that? That's definitely where the Netflix show is, where it's sort of like, for a lot of people who aren't fully paying attention to this, this also doesn't really feel like it really exists yet because it's been so secretive. When do you think we'll get that first look at the Netflix show?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know if they would put the money behind it to make a Super Bowl ad, and if you're already saying that maybe it's kind of be disconfirmed already, then that kind of supports that. But I don't know. I guess I would suspect, like you're saying, in the next couple of months, if they really are going to do summer, I wonder if it's like an early summer release to sort of get everyone with it, or maybe sort of like the end of it. But I don't know. I don't know. I would hope that it would be pretty soon, considering, you know, what it seems like their production schedule has been so far, but I'm not really sure.
So yeah, it's just kind of most of this month's been sort of like grasping at straws on like the comic and kind of book side of things. We're obviously still waiting for when will the Azula comic be officially like, you know, revealed, solicited. Didn't happen for the January solicits, so it realistically has to be either February or March if that's still to come out in the summer. The Yang Chen book 2, if that's happening this year, probably should also be announced within the next couple of months to hit some sort of a date, also theoretically in the summer. So that's sort of the stuff that we're waiting for. Other little things are like, say, I think we mentioned this on the last one, but that the Weiss Schwarz, or so it's Bushi Road, English conference is actually happening later on today. Now, it's not confirmed or not that there will be news on the Avatar set, but I'd be very surprised if at a specific English product thing they didn't say anything else about it. It's probably about time to show off maybe a little bit more visuals on that, and I think they are treating Avatar as a pretty big project, so we'll see if anything comes out of that. But the other big thing, it's probably just a kind of, again, still not absolutely 100% confirmed, but there's only really one way to look at it, and that is the soundtrack release that we've been waiting all these years for. Jeremy Zuckerman posted an Instagram story video that basically seems to show mixing of the Avatar soundtrack. It's the Agni Kai soundtrack from episode 3 when Zhao and Zuko have their Agni Kai, one of the most classic kind of sound pieces of music from the soundtrack. And apparently here this is sort of, I guess, a reveal that this award-winning mix engineer Nathan Jenkins is working on this with Jeremy Zuckerman as well. So this seems to line up with the sort of stuff that we knew, that obviously there was some sort of a concert score being prepared from, again, another Jeremy Zuckerman Instagram kind of video he put up. Now they're working on the mix here, and they actually played some of it. This has to be probably official confirmation of the soundtrack, but it's so difficult to say it until they say that like it's properly announced and like pre-orders go up. But it's happening, I think, is probably the best thing to say at this point. But Greg, what are your thoughts on this? Can we finally properly say that this is for sure happening?
Yeah, I mean, it sure seems like it if they're going through all that. I mean, I think this is like the most visual confirmation, to date that we've ever seen of it. But yet again, it's still not like announced by, the companies that are actually, funding this and producing it. So it's interesting that they're, allowing them to do this much, because you wouldn't, put this out there unless you had permission to do it in some form or fashion. So it's cool to see that it's getting out there, and usually mixing is usually more towards the end of the music production, so maybe they actually are getting close. Of course, this is just one song. Who knows about for all the other tracks that are on the album, or how many are actually on it and the full scope of things. So it still might be a little bit of a ways out there, but it definitely is more progress than we've ever seen before, that's for sure.
Yeah, and then now thoughts obviously are going to turn to like, okay, what way are you going to release this in terms of like, are we just doing the Avatar Book 1 soundtrack? Because that's been everything we've seen so far. This is a Book 1 piece of music. From his previous post, I think we saw up to about like episode 8 worth of like sheet music or whatever. So yeah. Everything Book 1 so far. Is that the way to do it? Like release it kind of like that in batches, and like here's Book 1, here's Book 2, Book 3, then go into Korra, or are they going to wait and do like full soundtrack releases? Where does Korra tie into this? Because I think we know Korra is not going to take as much work, because the issue I think is that like obviously they have like quite old like samplings of music from the ATLA soundtrack, whereas it's much more modern for the Korra stuff, and that's, I guess, more or less ready to go. But what are your thoughts on that? How do you think they'll do it? Will they be more kind of like piecemeal across the seasons, or will they try and collect these together?
That's a good point. I mean, it really does seem like they're only focusing on the first season right now, so that definitely makes me tend to believe that they're going to do it in sort of stages, and that might draw things out, maybe make more revenue and all that sort of stuff. So that might be the way to go. And then for when they do, which I assume they might do some physical releases of some kind for people who are into that, that'll also help with that along those lines as well. So I don't know, I definitely could see it being a bit more drawn out, especially if they're trying to make it worth it. But I don't know.
Yeah, like obviously the fear here is that we released the Korra soundtrack one book at a time, and apparently it didn't sell well enough to justify doing more. Might the same thing happen here? Probably shouldn't if they have the full backing of like Avatar Studios, and I think they know how much the music is wanted. But if they know the fandom, they probably would want to do some sort of a kind of like deluxe collector's set that, it has stuff with it, like whatever you want to do, interview content. Because I think people would like to, especially with the Avatar soundtrack, like know what the process was about sort of like remastering it, and like how different the stuff was from like recordings in 2004 or something like that compared to like 2022 recordings, and how that all worked and what had to be done. Could anything be kept? Like, people would, I think, really like to know what that is, and stuff like that. And even just to have like a little booklet that just says anything about the music, like, because we're all wondering, like, are they going to use a lot of the sort of like fan made up track names, or are they going to commit to what they were called internally in the first place? Because I think a lot of people still feel that the ones that are up on YouTube are official when we know they're not really official. It's the actual music, it's just named and put together in kind of unofficial ways. But it seems like it's finally happening. No idea about the release. I would hope that maybe they can get one of these out ahead this year. That would be something really nice to have. But we don't know, of course. And then we don't even know where it would be announced or how it would be announced necessarily. I don't really have too much confidence in the official Avatar social media channels, but that's that. I suppose the final thing we probably have to mention is just, again, Avatar Legends role-playing game Kickstarter. It's getting towards the end of the shipping, but they seem to be having more and more problems. It seems like there's about, 2,300 EU orders that there seems to be some major problems with. It's probably the most kind of harsh language I think we've seen Magpie use describing their shipping partners, that like they're basically not listening to us or doing what we're asking them to do. It's causing all of these problems. People are getting more and more frustrated as either they still, after weeks and weeks of shipping happening, they either still haven't got any notification that their stuff has shipped, or it's just seemingly like stuck somewhere in the tracking delivery process. And then we of course know that like Asian regions, Middle Eastern regions have other delays on top of that, and it just seems like it's turned into a bit of a disaster, for sure. But what are your thoughts on this as we sort of go into like we're about to enter like the second month of like shipping ongoing for this project?
Yeah, it definitely seems like this just wasn't, I don't know, maybe just it really was just too much above what they were prepared to sort of handle with, which I guess is kind of unfortunate. But yeah, some of the posts from people receiving them and either being damaged or just being, not in the best of condition, definitely is kind of sad to see, considering how, excited everyone was for this on, the original release of the Kickstarter and everything.
Yeah, like I got mine earlier this week as well, and yeah, the box was like, I wouldn't say it's the worst I've seen in terms of damage, but when I posted the picture, some people were like, "Oh, it's that level of damage." Like, so I didn't think it was like that bad, but some people were like, "Ooh, that's still pretty bad." Others have obviously had them completely like ripped open. No damage on mine, thankfully, and they're sort of, I think, lucky in a way that a lot of people are getting quite lucky that there is no damage, or that I think a lot of people are just accepting that, like, okay, I'll just accept that the corners are a little bit like messed up and move on with it. Because, at a certain point, like, you've been waiting a year for this. Do you want to have to wait like another like 2-3 months to get a replacement, or however long it's going to take? At the very least, it seems like they're offering replacements for pretty much any amount of damage. So they're good on that. It seems like they have enough stock to make that happen, which I guess makes sense because the retail release has happened as well. I suppose that's technically news as well, is that like as of earlier this week, this is now just available to purchase. Like pretty much everything from the Kickstarter is available to purchase, like on the Magpie website, and then whatever stores are going to stock it as well, which I think adds to the frustration from a lot of people that, for quite a few people, it will be quicker to just order the book directly from Magpie than having gone through the Kickstarter, which is, I think, something they probably wanted to avoid at all costs, but hasn't happened. So that's definitely not great, but it's working. They're getting there, and at the very least, when people finally do get the product, they're happy with pretty much everything that is there from the kind of quality perspective. So we'll see what the takeaways are once they get to the end of all of this, what way they're going to work the supplemental books and stuff like that. We don't know yet. They're focused completely on dealing with these issues related to shipping, as they it probably looks likely to go on for at least another month, if not longer, which is going to get us like somewhat close to the release of the first supplement if it takes long enough. But beyond that, we are just waiting for other news. Like I said, Azula comic should be announced next month or the month after. Weiss Schwartz news might be coming soon. We're just waiting for stuff. So we'll move over to the core of this episode, and that is our re-reviews for this week, which, like I said, is the Book 1 finale, two-parter for Avatar, and then Rebel Spirit for Korra. So we're going to start with Avatar. We'll go through the finale, we'll wrap up Book 1, and then we'll start Book 2 of Korra. So we have 119, so episode 19 of Book 1, Siege of the North, Part 1. So again, we'll start with overall thoughts on this. For me, it's a good episode. It's always one of those kind of interesting things with these two-part episodes where most people tend to always prefer the second part compared to the first part. But the first part is always very, very important in setting it up. You get all the kind of setup stuff out of the way here, which allows the second episode to do all of the big stuff. But there's still, I think, some very good, setup here, because it's a big battle that we're setting up with the Northern Water Tribe. There's a lot of stuff when it comes to like Sokka and Han and Yue, the Zhao, Iroh stuff, and then obviously setting up the spirit stuff with the Ocean and Moon Spirit is also quite important. Also, so yeah, I do tend to agree that I think 120 is better than 119. But this is still a very good episode and does have some action as we get into it towards the end of the episode as well. So, Greg, what are your thoughts on 119?
Yeah, I agree. It definitely has some good action in it. And I think, like you said, it does a really good job of setting the stage for these two-part episodes. And I don't know, I think, for a lot of the two-parters in Avatar, I always tend to think of them together, even if, some parts have, highlights to them. But I think, a lot of the sort of, I guess, understanding the Northern Water Tribe comes more so from, the first episode here, rather than the second one, which, is always going to be more action-packed because it's trying to, like, resolve everything and put everything together. So, yeah, no, I think, for the intro to this two-parter, it does a good job of just setting the stage of understanding, I guess, sort of where the Fire Nation is coming into play with everything and just sort of, what's happened. Because, there is like a little bit of a time gap between the last episode and this episode where you get to see, sort of the progress of at least some of our characters compared to where we last saw them. So it does a good job of bringing you up to speed pretty quickly. That gets you into the main finale.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we have to start. You mentioned the time skip there. And it's important because Katara goes from being a kind of like novice waterbender to being effectively a master at the end of this episode. Like, starting in book 2, she is Aang's waterbending master. And she's always portrayed in fights as being exceptionally strong. Leading up to, of course, like, she's really, really amazing in, like, say, like the book 2 finale and onwards. So this is a kind of important period of time for Katara as a character, because, like, this is at least the start, from the start of the series. This is her arc, basically. She wanted to go to the north, master her waterbending, and here she's accomplished it. So, what's your take on how much time has actually passed here? Because it can't be too long, because they've already spent quite a bit of time just getting here. Like, that's why we had all these kind of like side adventures with the one-off episodes. And there has to be quite a bit of time for the traveling in book 2 and the book 3 stuff. So how long can this actually be? And then to make it realistic, where it makes sense, where a character can go from having effectively no training to being effectively like one of, if not the most powerful waterbenders in the show. So what's your take on the timeline here?
Yeah, that is a good point there to make. And I mean, they do start it off with, Paku saying that, she's progressed faster than any other student. So, we'll include the fact that, she has some, gumption, some, she's had some motivation previously, to sort of get her to this point. So she's, obviously progressed faster than, you would say normally, because, it doesn't seem like any of the other students really want to like spar with her anymore or be on par with her. So I don't, that's a good point. And then, there's the fact that, they are, the Fire Nation did, Zhao did amass enough forces to actually, travel there, which granted the Fire Nation is, at war in general, so they're probably almost always at like, at the ready in order to like sort of form, but still, that's a pretty huge armada. So it's not like it's something that's going to be done in like, say, like a couple days or something like that. So I don't know. I don't know. I probably would put it at like a couple weeks because you can see that, a lot of the characters seem to have better relations with each other than what we sort of saw before, where, essentially they were just meeting, right? So, you can see that there's a bit more going on, I guess you could say, with like Sokka and Yue, so you can see that, or even just with the other people of the tribe in general. I mean, I don't know if I would say it's like, like months or something like that. Like that seems a bit, much for this, but I could definitely see it being like a couple weeks there, in order to get to, the point that we're at right here. Because it definitely seems like they're a lot more sort of like relaxed, and they weren't quite expecting the Fire Nation to come up to their doorstep anytime soon per se.
Hmm. Yeah, and in that sense, it makes sense. Like, we know the show's under a time scale and we know the structure of it now, but the group is kind of like, well, okay, we're here, we're going to train for as long as we need to until basically, like, Aang is a master, Katara is a master, and then the plan is obviously to go back to Amashu and train with Bumi, and then, I guess, sort out whoever the firebending teacher is going to be. Like, Zhang again, or find someone else. So they're not under the time skip. They feel that they theoretically could spend like quite a large amount of the time gap that they have here. I get the impression it probably is like, I would say like a month, maybe like just over a month, just to be kind of like reasonable about it. But at the same time, I think based on everything that we see from the show, it almost gives the impression that like bending training, if you have any like foundation in martial arts or like skill already, doesn't take like as long as you think it should. Because like Aang, for instance, because he's already done airbending, knows like the fundamentals of bending. So given that he doesn't seem to have any trouble with water bending, he just adapts to it quite quickly, and it's just about learning a couple of specific things. And then we assume that like, I think we've discussed this along the way here, that I think the implication is that like Aang has helped Katara to gain some of that sort of foundational, this is what it is to be a bender type stuff, because he's a master of a element already. So she comes in having some foundation. She doesn't have to start from the basics because she can control water. The fight she had with Paku was an example that she's already at a decent level. And so this is just about learning the kind of moves, the form, the philosophy a little bit more. So do you need that much time? I get it. We always like to highlight the old masters who've been bending for like 40, 50 years. But most of what we've seen is that it doesn't take a crazy long amount of time for, in most cases, to get to a level that you consider someone at least on the path to becoming a master. But that is that. The next scene in the episode is the kind of Sokka Yue scene, showing that they're getting on a little bit more. They are still kind of like hanging out over these weeks, and you could tell the two of them both really, really like each other. But every time they start to get really close, Yue brings up, that she is engaged, and they start to get into the idea of like, she doesn't like the person that she's engaged. If she had more freedom, the relationship with Sokka would just happen, because the two of them do just like each other. But this is where we get the scene where they go out on Appa. It's quite a nice little kind of romantic scene. But then it's interrupted, of course, by the black snow, the snow with the kind of soot in it, indicating that the Fire Nation is coming. And of course, Sokka knows about this because this is what they experienced in the south when those attacks came in. So really cool kind of reference here, because you get a few kind of allusions to this over the course of the episode, that the north has been so isolated. They're not really massively familiar with what the Fire Nation kind of does these days. Like, its tactics, what armor they wear, that sort of thing. So Sokka just having some recent experience with the Fire Nation is super useful in the defense here. So, and there's definitely some good stuff here. But what are your thoughts on this scene here with the alert to the north that the Fire Nation is coming?
Yeah, no, that's definitely, pretty like, imposing, just getting at least the idea, the sense of scale from Sokka and, how much the forces are here and, how he is pretty valuable. Like, it definitely, seems like he's definitely, you know, starting to begin to live up to his whole idea of, being a warrior and being out there and, protecting tribe and everything that he's sort of, has in his mind that, he's always, wanted to be really good at. And now you can actually see that, he really is sort of developing that part of his character. So that's nice to see his arc having that here and, to see the relationship that he's having with UA despite, everything that's going on and, previous engagements, it just sort of shows you the progress of how things are going, at their time up here in the north. So it's definitely a good way of sort of just understanding, I guess, sort of the looming threat that's coming.
Mm-hmm. And I know there are some fans out there who don't super like the Sokka UA relationship because I think it happens like quite quickly and there's not as much kind of like depth to it. And it's kind of like, yes, I can see that, but I also kind of like the simplicity of it. If it's just like the two of them just like each other, that's how they feel. And it's just the kind of complexities of because she's the princess and has all these duties, she can't have that relationship with him, but she would really, really like to, and that adds, I think, something to it, and it makes the big events from like episode 20 kind of feel quite meaningful because it's very much a kind of what could have been, and especially when you get to the end and you kind of find out that like, oh, in a way, UA's kind of life has already been almost like predestined in terms of like this was always what was meant to happen. So either way, in a way, this relationship was kind of never going to particularly work out overall. So I like it. You can definitely feel that could have used something in there, and that like I probably wouldn't mind if they did like a comic short story that takes place within the little time skip between 18 and 19 just to cover a little bit more. But what's here I think is pretty good. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's kind of too quickly done? Or do you like that it is just a kind of simple, the two like each other, so we're just going with it?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely do seem like they're just sort of going with it. And I think part of it probably is sort of the missing time skip there that really sort of, would indicate more so to us, the viewer, sort of the depth of their sort of friendship, because you do get a little bit of it here. So you can see that there is something between them, but, that doesn't really, I guess for the onus that it has on Sokka's sort of like personality sort of going forward, where like he gets upset where someone makes fun of the moon spirit because he was in a relationship with her for a little bit. Maybe some of that quite isn't seen to have as much bearing, but I think over time you get to see how much that sort of relationship did mean to Sokka, even if you don't see it sort of like immediately here in this episode. But yeah, I think, for what they're trying to go for, it's not trying to be sort of a in-depth sort of, they've grown together sort of over time. It's sort of just one of those things that just sort of happened in the moment that, is unfortunately a bit sort of tragic since it was almost, pretty much never going to be.
Mm-hmm. We get the kind of big speech as kind of Arnok asks for like volunteers to kind of join the like attack and all the missions that they're going to have to do. And it's very interesting. They have the speech of like noting that many of the faces like before us will vanish from the tribe, and they cut to Yue, Paku, and then Han, which is like the first time we've really seen Han. And it's interesting to note that obviously like Yue quote unquote dies, becomes the moon spirit. Paku survives but actually leaves for the Southern Water Tribe at the end, and then Han quote unquote dies, disappears, falls overboard, is never heard from again. So it's kind of like, okay, they all technically don't appear again in some way, like leave the tribe. But there's an interesting idea of they're like teasing the idea of one of these three characters won't make it. But it's a nice scene, I think, to again highlight Arnuk is the chief of the North. He asks like basically which warriors want to participate or not, and the scene where they all have to go up and kind of take the mark is quite interesting. Especially like the emotion as like Sokka goes up and he doesn't go up to Yue to get it, and kind of she has to watch on and kind of she feels a bit helpless about just the situation that's happening. She kind of wishes things could be different. But what are your thoughts on this speech scene from Arnaud?
Yeah, no, I thought this was pretty good because it definitely, I think this is when you're really starting to understand sort of like everything that's going on and how they're really going to try to sort of deal with this. And, something that, they've known it's been a thing for a while, but, they, like you mentioned earlier, they have been pretty isolated. So they haven't really had to deal with it that much, at least not in, say the last 85 years or so, that this is really something that, they're taking to heart here. And, to see that, Sokka's going to go for this, special mission. And, he's had sort of a falling out of sorts with UA recently, it definitely puts, I don't know, the seriousness of the situation in the forefront.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing they highlight again, is that the Northern Water Tribe doesn't really begin to change until effectively Eska and Desna become the chiefs, which is going to be interesting because like we're discussing similar kind of content in Korra later on as well. That in a different era, if Yue was given more freedom, like she could have just decided to be in the relationship with Sokka and there not be a problem. But it's 70 years plus too early for that to happen. They still have the customs and like where she as the princess is expected to do this, do that in line with all the customs of the Northern Water Tribe, and still representing the whole idea like that's the difference between the two tribes. Even though they're not in conflict as such in this era, that's the difference. That's where you can see why the South formed from the North, because of stuff like this. But then we get an interesting scene with Aang, where it's Aang's kind of main arc, apart from like his being the Avatar, bridge between the worlds, spirit world stuff. But this is what he's trying to accomplish in the finale: is that there's a big battle coming up. He wants to make a difference this time. Like, he's not going to run away. He's going to be here, be the Avatar to confront the Fire Nation. He wants to make a difference. And we just get a whole solo scene where he just goes out on Appa to confront the first couple of, like, scout ships. And we see him take out one with relatively little trouble. Like, him and Appa work super well together to take out a ship in full. Then the Water Tribe people come out, ice up the ship. And he comes back later and reveals that he took out like a dozen ships, but the fleet that they're up against is like 100 ships, and they're all filled with tons of troops. So Aang feels like he hasn't made a dent, even though he took out 12 full ships, pretty much on his own. So it's an interesting one. They don't linger on this like arc for Aang like that much, but it's a nice reference to have just there at all, I think, to just highlight that, oh, yeah, he doesn't want to run away here. He wants to be here to help, be the Avatar. That's exactly what you want. From the start of book one, like the reluctant Avatar, to being the leader, like starting the battle is a good thing for him. But what are your thoughts on kind of Aang's kind of solo battle here?
Yeah, no, it definitely is a good thing. And it's nice that they sort of, since we've criticized that before, that it seems like he's almost too laid back. And even, in the beginning of this episode, he was pretty sort of laid back playing with Momo. But, you definitely can see that, when things come to pass, he is, focused on the task at hand. Like he does have, sort of the matureness to sort of understand what's going on, especially, the battle and the war and everything like that. So I think it's good that you get to see him, sort of jump into the action straight from the beginning, and for him also to see sort of just the scale and the scope of things. Because initially, I'm sure he was thinking that I could definitely do a lot of this on my own. Like he doesn't even wait for any of the other troops to sort of support him in the first go here. But it becomes pretty quickly apparent that this is on a scale that he really can't sort of manage. Like he really is just one kid at the end of the day. And even with all the Avatar powers, even if he had perfect control over it, it still would be pretty tough, even for like a fully realized Avatar. So it's definitely good for us, the viewer, and for him to see. This is a lot bigger than just him. Like you really get to understand, sort of the power that the Fire Nation has and the reason why they've been, able to sort of, keep this machine going on the war for all these years so far.
Yeah, because it is interesting, the idea of like, yeah, he does this on his own without using the Avatar state. Could he win it on his own with the Avatar state? Because that's what we're gonna like discuss in the next Avatar kind of rewatch when we get around to it, and the Avatar state and what General Fong's plan is, which is just to lead with Aang at the front in the Avatar state, and that should win. But it's interesting that we get stuff like I think it's the Yang Chen book references the idea of like wartime avatars, and like some of them did kind of fall in battle. That even with all that power against that many ships firing at someone, like you could still get hit with that much coming at you, even with all the power of the Avatar state. And given that the whole Avatar cycle is on the line, you can sort of see the problem, and it actually takes Avatar state plus all powerful spirit to do that level of like win a war on your own type level of power. So yeah, we'll cut over to Iroh and Zhao, who have some interesting kind of scenes along the way. Their dynamic is very interesting because obviously like Zuko's in the background of all of this, hiding out on the ship as they make their way to the Northern Water Tribe. But obviously Iroh is here effectively as like Zhao's consultant, military strategist here. And Zhao has his plan in place. He knows what he wants to do, and it's weird because in a way he like agrees with most of Iroh's advice right up until the very end step, in that they're both like, yeah, we're gonna stop the attacks once we hit nighttime because it'd be silly to attack the Water Tribe when they're at their strongest, given that we're very close to a full moon. We get to see shots of that, highlighting that the difference in kind of power level between like the sun being out versus the moon being out. Iroh knows this well, and Zhao knows it too, because this is effectively the reason why the Fire Nation has basically not really attacked the North in all of this time, is because it's always going to take a long time to invade the Northern Water Tribe, and if you can't attack half of the time, it's just going to become this like battle of attrition. So this is Zhao trying to make a like immortal name for himself here by finally like defeating the tribe that they've never been able to defeat. And it's very interesting because he kind of alludes to what he's going to do without saying it for a couple of scenes. That like, oh, I'll deal with the moon, and Iroh's like, what do you mean by that? But what are your thoughts on a lot of these Iroh and Zhao scenes?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting dynamic here because it's like, Zhao sort of respects, what Iroh's done in the past, but he also sort of, pokes fun at the fact that, he didn't actually succeed. Like he did, really well, but, it is still, what's considered like a legendary failure in the Fire Nation. So like he has his worth, and, he does, like you said, he does agree with him, but he also has this, behind the scenes plan that, Iroh doesn't know about until sort of the very end here. And, Zhao, in his typical sort of, smugness, has this, confidence that, his plan, will work somehow. Which, for the most part, it almost does. But, there's other, forces at play here as well.
We do get a very nice emotional scene as Zuko does head out finally on his own, and Iroh kind of sends him off. He's very worried about him, and he does say that ever since he lost his son, he does think of Zuko as his own son. And, you can see that this hits Zuko as well, the emotion of it. It's a very nice scene to finally just get like him full on saying that, because it's the way everyone has always interpreted their dynamic. It being said is very, very good here. And the reminder about, remember your breath of fire, which he does end up using. But it does speak to the kind of like almost like crazy levels of what Zuko is going to do here. He's infiltrating the Northern Water Tribe on his own to try and capture Aang in the middle of like a big siege. It's like it's a crazy plan, and Iroh's just kind of going along with it here. But obviously he'll refer back to this as like a crazy incident later on. It's very interesting to just see this, and especially with the end scene for Zuko in this at the end of these two episodes, that like, you know, this was the last big crazy thing that Zuko did in a way. But what are your thoughts on this emotional scene between the two here?
Yeah, I like this. It's nice to see, their relationship develop to this sort of point here where they can have, with everything that's gone and all the craziness and the attempted killing of Zuko in the previous episodes, like it's definitely something to see, the relationship here and how it means to them. But, Iroh still, letting Zuko attempt this sort of, crazy feat. And, like you say, he does, mention it later on as this is like something that you did pretty much in poor planning. And you can see that, especially in the next episode, how it turns out in the end for Zuko. But, Zuko is still very driven at this point towards his own sort of personal goals here that he's willing to do, something that's, pretty crazy with, out much support. Like Iroh is there, but Iroh, couldn't really do too much to help him directly at this point. So Zuko is really on his own, just trying to sort of figure things out. So yeah, no, I think it's definitely, I don't know, it's an interesting part of Zuko's character that you get to see here for sure.
Mm-hmm. We then get some scenes with where we get properly introduced to Han as being the guy who's leading this special mission to basically take out Zhao, the leadership. And Sokka, of course, is the one who has all the key information, and we get the idea that Arnuk trusts him as a member of their sister tribe, but also as someone who has recent experience going up against the Fire Nation. Han, of course, just has that more stereotypical kind of like northern persona where he just views Sokka as being from the south, as just being like a, southern savage type thing, doesn't really care about him. But it does come out that this is the guy who Yue is going to marry, and when they do get to talking about her, he just talks about her in the ways where it's just like, yeah, she's cool and all, but it's more about like the perks of marrying her, that he's basically marrying into royalty. That's what he really cares about, not so much her as a person. And, he does insult Sokka as well. So those two things in combination, Sokka attacks him, of course. He gets taken off the mission, but interestingly, Arnuk does it partly because Sokka attacked Han, but also he specifically wants Sokka to look after Yue in all of this, which I find to be a very interesting kind of thing, in that, like, he's also going along with the arranged marriage to Han, but he doesn't put Han as the one to look after Yue. It's Sokka specifically, so it's an interesting thing to consider here. But I like this scene. Han is obviously a character who's meant to be hated, and probably should be the one most people vote for as like least favorite character, I think, because he's purposefully, I think, written that way. But Greg, what are your thoughts on these scenes here, getting introduced to Han?
Yeah, I mean, Han definitely, has that sort of persona sort of embedded in his character. He definitely is more the sort of typical sort of, upper crust, I guess, jerk type character here. And, that definitely grates against Sokka and sort of what, he's been sort of, I guess, his general sort of upbringing here. But yeah, it definitely is something to see that, is Arnuk, sort of aware of the relationship. I wouldn't be surprised if he isn't, that Yue and Sokka have here. But I mean, I think regardless, it would make more sense to keep Han on the mission, considering he is leading it, and he has been for whatever preparedness that they've done before Sokka was there and after Sokka was there, would know the most about, sort of the mission at hand. Now, granted, we do know the end result of the mission, and it's like, was that really worth it? But, I guess it was all sort of developed in that way just to sort of not be successful in any sort of regard. But, I guess it's sort of the setup for it, makes sense, enough for it to keep sort of working there. But yeah, no, I think it is, interesting to see that, despite, Sokka not being on the mission, he does sort of get the better end of the deal.
Mm. Yeah, Arnook is a very interesting character because even in like the comics, for instance, I don't think we've ever come back to Arnook. Even in North and South, he wasn't in those comics. Even though he maybe probably should have been included to a certain degree. It would have been nice to see like if what actually happens here, because we're obviously still a little bit confused about what exactly happens when we go from Arnook's the Northern Chief to Unalaq's the Northern Chief, and then Unalaq and Tonraq's father was the chief before them. Is it the same family line here, or is Arnook's family line over because of what happens with Yue here? I'd like to know kind of some of this stuff, because otherwise you'd think that like Sokka has this like amazing like strong connection to the leadership of the North, and that should really help things going forward. With like Sokka's dad being the leader of the South, but we never really come back to it at all. Do you have any thoughts on that? Just like kind of Arnook, kind of like post book one.
Yeah, no, that is something that we don't really get to see much of his character at all in any sort of regard. And I don't know, is he sort of like, an isolated type of, I don't know, appearance of him where we're seeing him in this sort of way, or just, Northern Chiefs. I mean, we have, a couple other examples of people leading the Northern tribe, right? So like we can see sort of what it develops into, but I don't know. It definitely seems like he might be one of those leaders that's like in sort of the, I guess, transition period of them sort of like, becoming, more open to things compared to what we've seen them, I guess traditionally being, which would make sense considering the timeline of things, right? But yeah, there definitely doesn't feel like there's much to him, other than what we get to see here in these initial sort of, episodes.
Mm-hmm. Then we start to get into some of the first kind of like big lore, kind of like spirit information kind of reveals, where Yue begins to talk about how the moon was the first waterbender, and how her ancestors saw how it pushed and pulled the tides, and they learned to do it themselves, and that's the sort of like basic legend of waterbending. And she describes how the motion and the moon and ocean spirit are important in the North and kind of represent strength and life for the water tribes. And this prompts Aang to realize that, hey, maybe we can get help from the spirits, given what we're kind of like facing here. And so this is where we get the introduction of the spirit oasis and the two koi fish that are in the pond there as the most spiritual place in the Northern Water Tribe. Obviously, it's stuff like the kind of legend here. That is why people say like beginnings like contradicts stuff. But I don't know, even from I think the first time we heard it, like that is a vague description of how people learned waterbending. Like they looked at the moon doing stuff and just learned to do it themselves. Like how did they learn to do it? That's always been my thoughts with stuff like this, and then we'll discuss in like I think 202 when they describe the kind of similar thing for earth bending, and then even then, like the animals begin to come into play for the other elements. It's a legend. They clarified the exact details on it later. This is specifically described as being like a legend. This is the stories that people talk about as a general way to describe it and really heavily connect the moon to things. It's still important for like the kind of fundamentals, the philosophy of waterbending, push and pull. It's just not directly how people got the power. But what are your thoughts on some of our kind of, I suppose, really first real kind of spirit world information? Because we talked about before, like 107 doesn't tell us as much as you'd think. And this is effectively our first real dive into proper spirit world stuff.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. This definitely gives us more, I guess, sort of direct, thoughts on spirits and how they're sort of interplay with the world. I think, both of these episodes do a lot of that. And, you can tell that some of it probably isn't, as flushed out as we later on get it. But I think, for the most part, they purposely keep a lot of it, kind of vague. And like you said, as a legends of how, they learned water bending so that, it doesn't really sort of contradict or, at least have too many, cross issues with, what eventually becomes more so into play. Like it's more about sort of it seems like it's more like the spiritual sort of philosophy than sort of the technicalities of how things are actually, working or how they actually sort of develop or who, specifically, taught them, the exact technique of waterbending or, what they use in their sort of current day there. But I like, this setup for it. I like the whole idea of the spirit oasis, how Aang reacts to being in this area, just how sort of like, unique it feels in this, whole sort of area, the Northern Water Tribe here. Like it definitely, I don't think it's something that I would have thought, sort of like would existed in this sort of, tundra that they have set up here. So it's interesting to see it here, and that, it does have, that sort of spiritual pressure or presence that, this can exist in this sort of environment that definitely, feels pretty unique and something that's cool towards the show having.
Hmm. Um, yeah, and the last couple of scenes here are that, yes, Yue brings Aang and Katara to the Spirit Oasis, of course. Aang eventually meditates into the spirit world. Pretty shortly after he does this, Katara's like, hey, Yue, you can go off, I'll protect Aang. Zuko shows up, and so we get some bending action here. So we get Katara in her first kind of proper bending fight here, and it's pretty nice because it kind of really highlights that, like, oh yeah, like apart from the Paku fight, we've never overly seen Katara in just like one-on-one fights, and you see straight away that the style of fighting that say like Aang and Zuko typically have, where they can kind of stand in front of each other and block and dodge really carefully, Katara can now do that as well. And Zuko even notes that, like, oh, you found a master. That's interesting. And that she's not just the kind of girl with Aang who can occasionally do some interesting waterbending stuff. Like, she's basically a master. Um, but she gets the advantage initially because the moon is out, but then the sun comes up, the power balance like shifts, and suddenly Zuko has the advantage, takes out Katara, and he just proceeds to grab Aang and take Aang like deep into the kind of like wilderness, like the tundra of the Northern Water Tribe, because that's all he can kind of think to do. Um, Now you kind of wonder like what exactly was the plan here. He notes that the blizzard is what's like stopping him, but I'm guessing he was just hoping to like hang out in the tundra somewhere for a while until the kind of war came to an end, and then like sneak Aang out somehow like after this. But it just shows that the plan isn't fully there, but it's the drive to do this, even though it's like insane what he's doing. Um, but yeah, lots of interesting stuff here. But what are your thoughts on this? Katara versus Zuko being, I suppose, the main thing here.
Yeah, no, I thought, getting to see their one-on-one battle here and, eventually how it concludes and everything, I think, it just goes to show, like you mentioned, sort of the progress that Katara's had, sort of her master-like abilities or, submaster abilities that she has here. That they're able to have, such a one-on-one here. And, there definitely is, sort of a scaling here with sort of the environmental factors that's sort of contributed to them, which, seems to play a lot into this, which, I wonder if Qatar was more mature in her sort of abilities, would that have mattered as much? Or if there always would have been sort of that slant regardless, like how much would it have, given either or sort of the advantage in this sort of situation here. But the battle itself is cool. It's definitely a good one to see at this point here. And, definitely, like you mentioned, Zuko definitely is all sort of drive and determination at this point, and not as well as sort of like calculating as, you might sort of want to think he is or he eventually becomes.
Hmm. And I will say, just in regards to this, I am glad that the show ultimately doesn't lean too much into like bending battles are like most oftentimes determined by like the sun being out or the moon being out. That this is really one of the only like examples of this really being in play, apart from obviously instances where we're dealing with like solar eclipses, full moon. So in this case where it's not quite a full moon yet, it's about to happen. Um, I get it because they want to emphasize it here in the Northern Water Trial with a lot of waterbenders around. But I like that typically for like say Katara for most of the series, they don't overly focus on the idea that like she's only like strong at nighttime or anything like that. That it's a subtle power boost shift thing here, not super huge. Like this isn't like full moon comet kind of powers that go on here. Um, you wish they'd maybe like bring it up a little bit more often. Like, for instance, is there any instances like this that affect airbenders or earthbenders? Now, the implication seems to be that, like, if there is an actual storm going on, airbenders who are masters can harness that to a certain degree. And then I think the idea is that, like, if there's like an earthquake going on, an earthbender can do something with that to empower themselves. But it feels a little bit different than, like, kind of celestial bodies kind of moving and that changing thing. But what are your thoughts on this concept and how often, or I suppose not often, it gets used throughout the series and the franchise, full stop?
Yeah, no, that's a good point there, because we always talk about sort of how the elements play into things, and sort of how our characters are enhanced or sort of I guess unenhanced by certain aspects of that. So yeah, it definitely, I don't know, it definitely could come to play a bit more. But yeah, I think if they were always sort of waiting for sort of like the perfect time to do things, that definitely would sort of like hamstring a bit of the sort of like storytelling and sort of the battles that we see here. Just because they would always be sort of like relying on things, sort of like for if they could only use the elements if they had to have like a supernatural resource. Which, I mean, some of them, they are like that. Like, you can't bend water without water being there, but we have seen instances where you're able to sort of draw water out of the environment, and earth, that's usually plentiful around you, but sometimes you have to dig sort of deeper in forests, like we've seen in some characters being able to use it. So like if fire was sort of like in the way that we've seen it so far, like being restricted to just having to have fire there, then I think that would sort of take away a bit of things, at least as we currently see things and how they flow. So I don't know, I think it's cool that there is some sort of element to that, just sort of being able to use the natural environment, but it's not something that's so focused on that you have to have it in order to do things, because I think that would sort of dampen some of the fun of the series in general, even if that might not be as realistic as it could be, but that's okay for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the same as I think in some of the like kind of resource book things, they mentioned that certain benders are more powerful in different seasons of the year as well. And I'm glad they don't lean into that too much. And it's more like slightly more powerful in autumn for airbenders or whatever. So at this point, we're in episode 2, 120 of the finale. And we straight away go into the spirit world. So this is more or less our first time seeing the spirit world really. I suppose we technically kind of saw it when Aang met Roku, but it was more focused on Roku rather than where they were necessarily. This is really a location in the spirit world for the first time proper, in that immediately he meets this monkey spirit, Enma, who just basically ignores him and is just meant to be annoying. We get this interesting idea of like the Aang follows this light, which ultimately just leads him to the water, and he looks at the reflection in the water, and it's Roku, and that allows him to communicate with Roku, because it's like it's his reflection, one of his past lives. That's what's going on here. And yeah, we get lots of information here. So Roku reveals that the ocean and moon are ancient spirits. They crossed over from the spirit world to the physical world near the beginning, where they took on these mortal forms, and that Roku only knows of one spirit who's old enough to remember what those forms are and like the exact location and so on. and that is Ko, the face stealer. And he's advised to show no emotion or he will steal your face. So this is very, very interesting. First look at the spirit world, and then some very interesting lore about like mentioning like kind of capital T, capital B, the beginning, and stuff like that is kind of fascinating. And just in general, like the concept of like, oh, spirits taking on mortal forms, that's kind of interesting. And we know so much more about this now, but it is cool to get. This was like the first time us getting this kind of like deep lore and lots of references. Like Ko is one of the most memorable spirits out there. What are your thoughts on this first dive into the spirit world?
Yeah, no, Ko definitely is one of the most sort of memorable spirits, I think, for most of the fandom, and he comes back in some form or another plenty of times. So it's cool to see sort of our sort of like initial sort of look at him, or initial sort of idea of him at this point of the episode, and sort of understanding that there are sort of like older spirits, ones that have crossed over, just sort of how, I guess, their relation with, sort of the human world, like we definitely don't sort of get like the full grasp of it here, but, we get to see sort of the understanding of it through Aang, the person who would be, the bridge between the spirit world and the human world, sort of coming into play with these, and to see, just sort of the overall current, aesthetic of this part of the spirit world, and how it's relating to at least how Aang's currently state of being, or the current state of things, and how he's trying to sort of navigate it at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so we pretty much go then from there straight to Ko's domain. We don't spend too much time like traveling the spirit world. He finds it, and we see Ko, and he's this kind of giant centipede looking spirit who's the section where his face is, he constantly changes as he interacts with all the different beings he's taken faces from. And this includes animals, it includes humans. There is an interesting one where he seems to like have a spirit of like, it either is a mask, or there is some sort of like spirit that looks like, one of those kind of masks, which is interesting by itself. And again, the whole dynamic here is that Ko is sort of almost like trying to provoke Aang to be emotional, trying to like scare him, surprise him a little bit, without trying too hard, I suppose, on Ko's part. And Aang is just keeping his kind of stone, kind of deadpan face, interacting with him. And again, we get some very interesting lore here once more about how, Ko has met the Avatar before. Not you, but one of your past lives tried to slay me. And he says it was 800 or 900 years ago. And then he shows Umi's face, as we know. So this is the first reference we get to basically Avatar Korra, without actually mentioning Avatar Korra. But we know that this is that story. Now, the time that is given is wrong. 800 or 900 years ago should be more like 400 and like something years, because like we already know from earlier on in the series, Kyoshi is 400 years ago, which is the whole reason she's 230. And Korra is like one of the shortest lived avatars. It's off by quite a bit. But for a spirit, I suppose, is that actually that much time he's getting it off by? Probably not. That's the excuse I think you have to have here. But still, very, very interesting. Revealing that he took the face of someone one of the avatars loved. And this is where I will bring up, just as a reference to all of this, is that Ko is an interesting character, especially with what we learned about him in the comics, that his mother is the mother of faces. And effectively, according to her, Ko is this like weird spirit that is the way he is because he's just trying to get her attention. And I suppose that kind of is meant to inform why he's the face stealer. She's basically the creator of like faces and like identity almost. He steals that to try and get her attention, which is an interesting concept in that it means the mother of faces is an even more ancient spirit than Ko is, which by itself is interesting. And then it starts to get into the idea of like, yeah, some of these spirits are like directly related to like kind of humanity and like life in a way, in that I think they literally describe the Mother of Faces as being like the reason people basically look different than one in the comics. They say something along the lines of that, so it's quite fascinating what they talk about. But what are your thoughts on that? Like a reference to another past Avatar here.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely just shows you sort of the scope of, the avatars throughout, the eons, the generations, and how they sort of had to play, either with spirits or with, the spirit world, or, combination of the two, regardless of, the timing being off in this sort of early episode and trying to develop the sort of history and the lore here. But I think it's, it definitely is pretty cool to see sort of how, I guess from Ko's perspective here, things have progressed and sort of what he's had to go through. And yeah, we do know so much more about him than we did back then. So it's cool to go back to it and to see sort of where he started from and just sort of how, how he interacts with Aang. I think that's something that, is really notable, sort of, you mentioned sort of him trying to sort of, give him to have some emotion, you get to see Aang do, at least some reaction to some things, but he, he schools his face pretty quickly so that he doesn't get his face stolen. So, it's cool to see that Aang does, have some control, he's not also, go lucky all the time. That it's another instance of his maturity or just understanding the situation that he's around, that he can sort of interact with the spirit in this sort of way. So definitely seems like he's able to sort of do some of his bridging duties here, to some regard. But yeah, no, it's definitely a cool bit. And, the fact that we do get the reveal of what it actually is, and Aang sort of pieces it together is a good point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like the way kind of like Ko refers to Aang, because he's like, the Avatar, I suppose, is this ancient being as well to a certain degree, and it's like, oh, you've appeared before me again with like, you're a new person now with a different face, and so he's not angry at Aang because of what a past Avatar is. He understands that, but also is like, you are the same being effectively that did this to me before. And then, yeah, the ocean and moon kind of reveal happens. Aang asks about it, and Ko straight away reveals that, like, their names are Tui and La. He basically answers Aang's question in kind of like a riddle, but Aang still has to sort of figure it out that, like, they've always kind of, like, revolved around each other, push and pull, life and death, yin and yang. And that's when Aang realizes it's the two yin and yang colored koi fish back in the pond. That's the mortal forms of these two, like, ancient spirits. And he does, like, have a big, like, that's so cool, I just figured it out reaction. And then Ko turns around and Aang's just like, what happened? So he can't do anything. It makes me wonder, like, what exactly are, like, the mechanics of, like, the way that thing works, where, like, he can't take your face if you don't show emotion, but, like, what's the definition of emotion? He has to, like, see you have emotion and then his power activates. It's an interesting one, but I suppose it's kind of along the lines of, like, kind of Father Glowworm type thing of, like, I guess this is sort of like a curse type thing where it's just related to emotions with Ko, where it was more like exchanging names with Father Glowworm. But still, like, really interesting. The voice acting performance on Ko is also a huge part of it as well. And yeah, the way they animated as well, the constant changing of faces, showing different people and beings and stuff like that. And very ominous as well when Ko leaves. We'll meet again. And, like, as far as we're aware, Aang doesn't see Ko again, and then Korra doesn't meet Ko. It's obviously alluding to the fact he's an ancient spirit. He will meet an avatar at some point in the future, and he's confident of that. The other thing is that Ko seems to have some sense of being able to see the future, or at least know what's happening on the, like, Zhao side of the story, that Zhao's intent is to kill the ocean and moon spirit, so he can actually warn Aang that they're in trouble. So that's an interesting one as well. And then even more references, Heibai is revealed again, and that's how Aang gets back to the physical world. So lots of stuff going on here at the end. But any thoughts on some of that stuff? Ko saying we'll meet again. how he knows about everything seemingly happening in the physical world.
Yeah, I always thought that was interesting how he just seems to know what's going on, which I guess, I don't know, for some spirits it seems like they just have like, I don't know, some notion or the ability to grasp what's going on in the human world, even if they're not sort of like, on the same plane of existence. I don't know if that's more of just sort of like, sort of a older spirit sort of ability that they have where they can, sense things that are going on because they just have that connection with the human realm, or maybe it's just because at one point they, they had crossover because they remember when, the worlds were more sort of blended together, so they have that sort of idea. No, in the scheme of this episode, it doesn't really seem that odd per se that some random spirit would just happen to know what's going on. That's sort of like the crux of what we're sort of going here to sort of find out. So it works out in the sense that we have it here, but that is something that sort of stands out there. But no, it's cool that he's just sort of revealing this information. Like, it's just more sort of like info lore dump that we're getting here that we didn't really sort of know before. So I think that's pretty cool just to see sort of the expansion on that in terms of what we get here. And it does seem really sort of ominous. I mean, this whole set dressing that they have for this part of the spirit world is really sort of ominous in general, which I guess, makes sense considering they're not really here, Aang's not here for fun. He's here for information because there's a war looming outside, right? So it kind of makes sense that this is sort of, in that sort of realm of feeling and vibe at this point in time.
Yeah, and just the fact that like there's a war going on in the physical world, but the spirit world, there's almost like nothing happening. Like, Aang arrives in an area that's pretty much like just some trees. He sees like one spirit, a light, some water. Ko's kind of like domain is just like a kind of like staircase down into just like a big cave, and that's where Ko hangs out with seemingly nothing else going on around other than there being some like spirit monkeys around. And you're just kind of like, oh, well, I guess that's the spirit world. I don't really know what's going on here, but it's just one part of the spirit world, as we know. There's loads of other places, because I know a lot of people complain about like Korra spirits because they're so like almost like small scale compared to the crazy spirits that we see in Avatar. But in this episode specifically, we're talking about like the Moon and Ocean spirit, which are like within like the top tier of spirits basically, and then Ko, who's probably one of the most like charismatic spirits at the very least. Of course, there's random spirits as well, because we see Enma in this episode, for instance, is just like a random spirit as well. So there's that as well. Anything else to say about the Ko scene? I don't really think so. It's just I suppose other than it's interesting to say, like, I think Father Glowworm in the books, when he refers to Ko, is just like he considers Ko to be a bit weird for actually just like being okay with like humans basically coming up to talk to him. Like most spirits won't actually like engage with humans, I suppose, but Ko will actually start conversations with them. I suppose mainly because he thinks he can steal their face by just like scaring them at some point, but it's interesting given what his personality is that he's a smooth talker, I suppose, is the big thing with Ko. But yeah, there's a couple of scenes that happen before this in the episode, and I think we have to talk about Zuko basically talking to Aang while he's still in the spirit world in the cave. Big scene, because he mentions his sister. He mentions that she's a firebending prodigy, unlike Zuko. She was born lucky. He was lucky to be born. And that line especially is very like defining of Zuko and how he kind of feels about himself at this point, that's how he views like his dynamic with his father, is that he'll always be below Azula, and he is struggling to just try and get his honor back at this point, whereas in his mind she can do no wrong at any time. And he almost views it as like it's the same with Aang. Aang is born lucky, like all this good stuff for the most part seems to be happening around him, and it just leans into the idea of he's in this bad mood because of course the blizzard is preventing him from succeeding. And it feels very much like we're going to get in like Bitter Work, for instance, where he's like, why won't you shoot a lightning bolt at me so I can test out this ability type thing? Why does nothing ever go right for me? And that is representative of like first half of the series Zuko. That's exactly what like his character is before he realizes kind of the flaws in what he's trying to accomplish. But what are your thoughts on the cave scene with Zuko?
Yeah, no, that it definitely does have a pretty sort of meaningful impact to Zuko and sort of his, how he views everything. And like you said, his sort of arc for the first half, how he's just, you know, time and time again, he's having to sort of go up against adversity for, his own sort of gains here, regardless of, them being in the right or the wrong. He just, he comes into conflict so much. And, maybe in the grand scheme of things, like even if there wasn't a blizzard, he really wouldn't have been able to sort of like do anything with Aang. Like, there's no way for him to get back to the Fire Nation that quickly, but he just sees it as another struggle, as something that's getting in his way, and that fact that he's had to live, despite being a prince and all the privileges that come with that, a relatively tough life in that sense compared to his sister, who we still don't know that much about, but we get to see a bit of her at the end of the episode, and even Aang himself, who despite everything that's going on, like he's had sort of the lifestyle that he's had, he has been generally done things, had things pretty easy going, but there's all this strife that Zuko's having to deal with, and it does seem like he's able to sort of overcome it to some degree. Like he's able to sort of escape with Aang from the whole sort of collapse that was happening out there. So he definitely has a lot of things that are sort of going for him that are lucky, but it's definitely not the best case scenario for Zuko.
We also get the Zhao scene where Han attacks and literally Zhao just like slightly nudges him like overboard. Now there is a splash, so he obviously falls into the water, but we never see him again as far as I'm aware. So like I guess he just goes back in the background, and because of what happens to Yue, he's just a completely unimportant character going onwards. But it was just a fun scene to highlight that, hey, the guy you hate, yeah, he didn't succeed. Maybe if Sokka was on the mission, they could have done something, but he wasn't on the mission. But the big thing here, again, more like kind of lore kind of information here, he goes into the whole idea of like, oh yeah, when I was younger, like I went to Wan Shi Tong's library and I found the identity of the ocean and moon spirits in his information there. And he basically views it as like, because he was the one to find this information, that this is his destiny. He was destined to use this information, kill these spirits, and basically open up the path to victory for the Fire Nation against the Water Tribes. He would go down in history as being the one who killed these spirits that basically empower the Water Tribes, led the Fire Nation to victory. This is like Zhao, a character all about ambition, and here is his ultimate ambition. It is to be the Moon Slayer, basically. So I like this. Like, I think as we've gone back through the rewatch of book 1 here, I think Zhao has stood out as being a lot more of a proper character than I maybe have ever given him credit for in the past. He's still, kind of power hungry to a certain degree, but I like that he has this kind of sense of almost like destiny to him here. Like, he has planned this out. He's got the information from the best source of information, and it's just the fact that he has the the willingness to go through with the idea, I want to kill a spirit, an important spirit, but I'm going to kill it for the Fire Nation. And we see Iroh is immediately like, no, like you should not do that. And they discuss like the whole idea that, I know you've been to the spirit world, Iroh, and that you kind of fear what happens there, but I don't. So lots of crazy reveals happening in this episode. But what are your thoughts on this scene with Zhao revealing his plan?
Yeah, I think this is pretty cool. I mean, I think, for all of, Zhao's sort of like hot-temperedness that we usually equate to him, the fact that he does have this sort of like super sort of calculated plan in order to sort of win this, battle for the Fire Nation, and something that, he knows they probably wouldn't be able to overcome without this one little element. It's definitely it adds a good bit to his character than we might not have thought that he had. And, the fact that this also is in line with, with Iroh and his sort of experiences with spirits, it really sort of adds to, I guess, sort of the intrigue of this episode, along with what we've already just previously learned about, the spirits and how they're sort of in the world here. So it's really everything sort of coming together, and the fact that, Zhao has this sort of history, like you said, like it seems like, at least to him, he has this like predetermined destiny that he's going to sort of achieve in this regard here. And I don't know, I think it definitely makes it seem, cooler than what we might have thought. And we do know sort of how his sort of story ends out in the end, beyond what just happens in this episode. So it's interesting to see how that sort of plays into things. Like maybe, there's more towards that sort of destiny than even he might have fully understood, or of course that he understood at that time.
Because yeah, of course, like I guess that means like it was basically Zhao who destroyed the Fire Nation wing of the library as well. So he has this big history of just not respecting spirits like at all. But we see like why he's doing this. Like we do get some scenes here as like the full moon does rise. The waterbenders go on the attack. They're just taking people out left, right, and center. And the waterbending is now powerful enough to just like destroy the machinery, as we see. Paku's doing some crazy things here. But at this point, like Zhao, Iroh are in the Northern Water Tribe. They're heading for the Oasis because Zhao knows from the library what Aang just learned from Ko, that it's the fish that are the spirits. So that's where they're heading. We also get Aang's spirit attempting to return to his body, which it does manage to do. Katara and everyone else follows Aang's spirit on the return. And we just pretty quickly kind of get this situation where, like, with the moon up, Katara just instantly defeats Zuko, because at this point it's a full-on, like, proper power boost. There's no chance for Zuko here. But interestingly, I think it's meant to be a kind of Blue Spirit style reference. Aang saves Zuko kind of like again, and won't let him just be left there to die in the middle of a blizzard. So that's what we get here. And we basically lead up to the idea. Zhao gets to where he needs to go, and he grabs the moon spirit Tui out of the pond. And we get the moon turns red, waterbending stops, but the moon is still like there and like on to a certain degree, but it's noticeably Aang and Yue both feel pain from this kind of spiritual thing happening. So what are your thoughts on this? We eventually get to this crazy situation where the moon spirit being taken out of the pond makes the moon go red and spiritual stuff starts to happen.
Yeah, no, that's definitely, pretty intriguing to see that, the whole, I guess, sort of, light from the moon has shifted into this different color that I don't know if that's sort of just like indicative of it being sort of, covered up, or because it's the Fire Nation that's, has the moon sort of captured. But it definitely, you can see how that shifts the whole idea of everything that's sort of happened from, the two, I guess you could say, like more spiritually connected people, feeling it, to people just sort of losing their sort of abilities at this point in time. Considering just sort of the sway of the battle, just a moment ahead of time, like you saw a scene with like Paku and his sort of abilities, to see, it shifts so quickly is pretty drastic to see in that sort of sense. And, something that probably wouldn't necessarily expect to happen, which leads, to even more sort of craziness to happen in the coming moments.
We do cut over and we get the kind of Yue backstory explaining like what her unique hair color and stuff like that. So she explains she was born as if she was asleep. She was going to die. Her father pleaded with the spirits and brought her to the oasis, and she was given life by the moons. So I think you notice this by the fact that, especially once the moon spirit dies, the colors that you see in the world are basically bending. And then I think Yue's eyes remain blue. Otherwise, like all the color, I think, goes away. So just highlighting that she does have that kind of aspect of kind of spirituality at play. But yeah, this is where Zhao gives his big sort of like crazy Moonslayer speech talking about how he will be like invincible and this is what he wants to be known as. It's his ambition once again. Everyone pretty much converges on the Spirit Oasis at this point, and it's this big confrontation scene about like, don't do this. Aang is actually the one to note that if you kill that spirit, it's not just that like you'll win the battle for the Fire Nation. Like you're destroying like a part of the world in doing this. You will shift the entire world out of balance by killing the Moon Spirit. Even Iroh kind of steps in at this point to like agree with this. Zhao, he's kind of listening to it to a certain degree. He does put the fish back in the water, but immediately firebends at it and kills it. And this is where we get Iroh attacking. He actually threatened Zhao just before this, and he goes crazy with the firebending, forcing Zhao to full-on retreat. But he does kill the Moon Spirit at this point. So very interesting, just like the big things happening here. And you have a scene where I suppose like the characters for one of the first times really noticed that like, oh hey, like Iroh is kind of different than Zuko. He kind of like agrees with us on a lot of things. Like he cares about balance. It's not just that like Iroh is like a villain. He's not going to attack us necessarily. That's something to note, just that like he's there talking to Yue and everyone else. But what are your thoughts on this, the big Moonslayer scene?
Yeah, no, you definitely get the sense from here that Iroh definitely has more, I don't know, calming nature to him compared to what we've seen before. Like he still was part of this whole armada that was coming towards, taking over, the Northern Water Tribe here. Like he was, Zhao's sort of like advisor, but he's not surprised of the sort of treachery that happens here. But yeah, this whole scene here is definitely pretty impactful. I mean, I guess, the idea that you definitely see that, this is where I guess you could say Zhao really goes sort of like off the rails in terms of his like ambitions, similar to Zuko in that regard, in terms of like, making the means to his end regardless of what's going to happen here. But, he does see, I guess, sort of the initial sort of disadvantage that he's at in this sort of situation here, but no, it really doesn't mean anything to him and what his, eventual goals actually are. And no, despite all of this, he does actually, escape the situation here. But no, it's interesting to see, even just seeing, Iroh sort of like in the heat of the battle here against, other Fire Nation soldiers, despite it being sort of a pretty quick scene because he does make pretty quick work of them. It's also something, of note to see as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think we need to talk about the whole, like what the Moon Spirit is, the power of the Moon Spirit and what's happening here, because compared to like everything else that happens, it is probably one of the weirder things in Avatar from like a spirit power perspective, where like, okay, it makes sense. You're doing the moon, the physical effect it has on Earth is that it makes the tides work and push and pull. That's where it comes from. But they're saying here that basically happens because the Moon Spirit is alive and has been basically in the physical worlds. The physical world has existed. And they're trying to make the point here that if the Moon Spirit is killed, you will stop that, which will effectively ruin, like, I suppose, the ecosystem of the planet, or that what effect the tides kind of stopping would have. That's what they're pointing out. But also, water bending turns off because of this. And it gets kind of complicated because water is, of all the elements, it's like the one that is like has such specific things like associated with it, like this, where like the other elements, like, okay, fire is a little bit different because you have the whole sun aspect, and it brings up like, is there a sun spirit that like we just have never had referenced before? That would make sense, but then like, is there an earth? We know there are earth spirits, but is there a like, capital E earth spirit type thing? Is there a spirit of the winds that like makes airbending? Can airbending be turned off by a specific spirit dying? And then why is it so specific to just this one thing? You could also ask the question of like bending, which I suppose spirits can't actually do. Why does a spirit make it happen or not? It's it's one of the weirder things, like I said, from a kind of lore perspective about like why does it work this way? And a lot of it probably comes down to the fact that like it's we're still in relatively early Avatar, and this is some of the first time we're getting into this kind of like deeper lore, what certain spirits actually do and are. But what are your thoughts on this? Because there aren't that many instances where we see stuff like this, where like a spirit dying changes the entire world type thing.
Yeah, that is something of note because I mean, it's like a one-to-one relationship here, right? Like the moon spirit is essentially the moon. And if it's gone, then there's no moon, and that throws everything out of balance, which is the whole point of why they don't want this to sort of happen in this situation, right? But as far as we know, we don't see that for the other elements. Now, I don't know, it wouldn't surprise me if there was, spirits that were more, in tune with sort of the other elements directly in some regard. I don't know. I mean, we do know that there are other spirits that are more responsible for sort of like, the understanding of the different elements of bending, right? So is there one of those that's sort of the most sort of ancient ones that, would have more of a connection with it? I don't know. There might be. But it definitely seems like the fact that these two spirits are more from the beginning, as they've mentioned in this episode, that they have more of a connection with their actual element in the world. Like they are the reason for that sort of part of the Avatar world even existing in the first place, and there might not necessarily be something along those lines for the other elements. Although I don't know, it kind of would be cool if there was one and that did sort of come into play in some regard. I don't know how that would work as well in the future series or whatever like that, but it's definitely something that could make sense. I mean, if this was sort of flipped around the situation and they did everything towards the ocean spirit would sort of like the oceans and everything sort of like dry up really quickly or something along those lines. I mean, that would still have the same effect on the waterbenders, in fact that there's no water for them to bend, at all in that sort of case. So it definitely is something to sort of consider, and I wonder if it's something that they will explore in the future.
Yeah, like that is the interesting point, because effectively like Koizilla is water bending effectively. So like, do they both basically allow water bending or not? And yeah, what's what? Like, is one the movement of water and is one water itself? Is that what they're kind of going for? Um, it's a little bit unclear, but it gets into kind of stuff like, for instance, like why people can bend in the first place. Like in the case of water, it's that a line turtle initially gave people something called the power of water that allowed them to bend. And it's like, if the moon goes away, that power of water suddenly doesn't work anymore. And what's the like connection there as such? It's kind of like a kind of more complicated. Now, this also kind of links into the sort of like kind of planets type stuff of like, say, like harmonic convergence and like eclipses and so on, the comets. These affect things as well. That obviously harmonic convergence is the lining up of all the planets, and something crazy happens from a spiritual perspective. But then like, what is the whole idea with the moon? Like, I almost forget the visuals of it, but when Zhao kills the moon spirit, does the moon like as a physical object go away, or does just the light from it go out?
Yeah, right. Like it's just a light that sort of is disappearing, right?
Yeah, so like the object, the moon as an actual moon, is still there. So it's sort of like the question of like, what's the connection there? Like, is it just that the power of the spirit is connected to it to make the physical world like operate the way it does, or what? Because it gets into the idea of like, when we do Avatar in space type stuff and we go to the moon, like, I think I've said this before, it's a bit of a kind of like mind blowing concept, but like for instance, what happens if you try to go to the spirit world on the moon? Like, do you come out in a different spot, or what's going on here? Because it's like, yeah, this is the physical world, but it's not just like Earth, it's an entire like world, and then the spirit world is its own thing, and like, are there spirit planets and what's going on there? it starts to get kind of crazy at that point when you overthink about it. But it's interesting to kind of like discuss, because they're showing us that it's this sort of stuff that's like affecting things. And like I said earlier, like it would be cool if we ever explored the idea of like if there is a sun spirit or anything like that. And then like I think the actual term like avatar is literally meant to mean like the spirit of like the planet. So, you know, that could have theoretically been like an earth spirit of sorts if they wanted to do it. But we move from that into the actual Koizilla scene itself. So again, this is quite an interesting one here, where Aang goes into the avatar state, kind of like triggered by the death of a notable spirit. He steps into the pond and basically connects with La, the ocean spirit, and they together combine to form this Koizilla water monster that's obviously like avatar state empowered, spirit empowered as well, double spirit empowered basically. And we get this crazy sequence where like the people of the water tribe bow before it and are basically like spared, passed over, and then the Fire Nation are like swept away by water as this kind of combined spirit form goes by. And we just get like it marches out to sea, sends all the ships like flying away with insane waterbending power, and this one act basically ends the siege of the North. It's just the power of this combined spirit form. It's a really crazy scene as we get the Fire Nation full retreat slash defeat here just by this crazy spirit action stuff. Wild stuff happening here, and that obviously like how do you look at this scene and not think that a lot of Fire Nation soldiers died in the middle of all this happening? Now the explanation for Aang is obviously that it's the ocean spirit in control of the combined form. I think maybe a little bit of kind of avatar state defense mechanism. But what are your thoughts on the Koizilla scene?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is pretty impressive the way that you see it and everything, and how, you know, considering that the moon is sort of darkened at this point, it's really the only thing that sort of like stands out in this environment, right? Like it has, you know, this unnatural blue glow that's sort of, you know, encompassing sort of like everything in its path. And, you know, when it does, you know, swipe at, you know, the Fire Nation shoulders, it just sort of completely sort of, you know, encases them, and they're just sort of gone at that point. It's like, you know, who knows where they're really at? Like, are they all transported like Zhao was, or are they all just sort of like immaterialized? We don't really know, but they're not going back to the Fire Nation, so they're definitely not there. But yeah, it definitely is sort of, I don't know, impressive to see, you know, this sort of large scale sort of invasion sort of pushed back by one, you know, sort of, I guess you could say, combined being, and the fact that, you know, they're able to just push everyone sort of back out to sea in this sort of situation here. And, you know, it doesn't seem like, you know, Aang has any sort of real sort of awareness or cognizance that, you know, he's doing this sort of thing. I mean, I don't think he doesn't like sort of like super pass out or anything at the end of it, as opposed to some other times when he's using the power, but he definitely seems sort of out of sorts, I guess you could say, from this sort of combined ability that he's using, that I don't think is something that most avatars would probably expect to have used in their time.
Mm-hmm. It's one of those weird things, because obviously the avatar state and the level of power it has kind of goes up and down depending on the scene. Where like I think when they in like the next episode, 201, when they show, I think, Karuk doing avatar state stuff, he's technically doing as big of a water bending kind of attack as the Koizilla does here, in terms of just making it like across the ocean kind of like wave type thing. But I guess it's just the idea that like there is just theoretically so much power in this combination as well. It does make me wonder though, and this is one thing that's always interested me, is that like, okay, this is Tui and Law, this is their mortal form. What do you think the actual spirit forms of these two spirits actually is? Because obviously they transition to making like Yue the kind of representation of the moon spirit, but is that just what they're like, that they have some sort of a humanoid style thing, or does the ocean spirit somewhat resemble that Koizilla monster thing? Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a good question there. Like, what were their original forms, or if they were there from the beginning, would they have even had sort of a humanoid form, because that wasn't really a thing at the time when they were there initially. So I don't know. Their original form really could have been sort of anything, as we've seen. Like, the creatures in the spirit world could be anything, right? So who knows?
Yeah, that because that if it's so early that like the physical world doesn't exist, and we know like the spirits aren't creative. Yeah, they all could have been just like basically kind of almost like Rava Vatu, where they're just sort of forms of energy with some symbols on them. These specific two just happen to, once the physical world form decided that we'll be the guardians of like the ocean and moon in the world, and that's what they did. It gets into the idea of like sort of like spirits when they're created, their thing that they do, are they created like with that in mind, or is that something they like decide to? So like Wan Shi Tong is like the knowledge spirit. Did he choose to just be that, or is that like his kind of imperative as a being is to gather knowledge, and that's just who he is? Again, that's sort of spirit stuff that we don't know for sure exactly, but it's interesting to consider. But yeah, then we get obviously Zhao has fled at this point. Zuko finds him. They have a fight here because this has been building up the entire season. Zuko has the edge in their fight. They don't show too much of it here because, of course, there's so much other stuff going on at the time. Obviously, this is at the point where Koizilla basically wins the battle here. But Law sort of puts Aang back at the Northern Water Tribe and then goes off on their own. And this is where we get the moment where La just suddenly like appears over like Zuko and Zhao, grabs Zhao as the one who killed their, I don't know what way you'd call this. Is this kind of like a brother sister type spirit style relationship or whatever? Killed the spirit they're most closely associated with, and we always thought until like Korra that this was just the death of Zhao is killed by just being dragged under the water. But actually, Law takes Zhao to the spirit world and puts Zhao in the Fog of Lost Souls, the spirit prison. So that's a really interesting reveal. But in this, there's some interesting characterization here where even though Zuko's out for revenge against Zhao, when Zhao is being pulled away by this spirit, Zuko does reach out to try and save Zhao. And Zhao pulls his hand back and sort of like accepts his death. And it's an interesting one because I think there's a few ways you can interpret it. Like, do you accept this as being sort of like the pride of Zhao, just in a way like accepting what he's done, or is it just refusing help specifically from Zuko that he doesn't want to do? What are your thoughts on this scene, quote unquote, death of Zhao?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think I definitely see it as sort of, Zhao's sort of pride here, not willing to sort of like accept any sort of help from, someone who he was, thought was like basically against him or against the Fire Nation with his means to his own ends. Like, he can't see sort of past that in order to sort of have the help here in this sort of last sort of battle here. But it definitely is sort of a book ending to sort of their sort of conflict that they've had, and Zhao, as far as we know of, from his sort of side of things in the story. Like, we do see him later on, and we do see, I guess, sort of what his sort of still ambition goal is, but for all intents and purposes is pretty much the same sort of ending for his character.
And I think it is a very fitting end because he was warned by Iroh and others that basically don't mess with the spirits, like specifically trying to go out to kill spirits. Something is going to happen to you. Like, I don't care what you think your destiny is, there will be a response to you doing this. And him being dragged down into the depths by a giant like Koizilla hand is very fitting for the character, and it's almost sort of like him accepting that, like, well, I must have been pretty important if I have to be like taken out by a giant spirit. That to some extent, like, he succeeded. He angered the spirits so much that they killed him, put him in prison forever. that he committed a crime that goes like cross worlds, basically. You know it's bad when you're put in spirit prison. Other stuff, of course, at this point, we have to deal with the UA source. So Iroh notices the whole idea that she has the moon spirit's life energy within her. She can give that life back. And again, UA's been all about duty, ultimately, to her tribe, and this is something she has to do. Even though Sokka has to protect her, this is just a crazy situation where she's the only one who can do this. He has to let her do this, and so she gives that life back to Tui. She collapses immediately. Her physical body like fades away. Like, it's not just that her dead body is left there, it's her body like fades away, kind of in a way like highlighting the idea that she is only alive because of like spiritual effects. And so once that kind of Tui energy is gone, her physical body just kind of fades into nothingness, and effectively she kind of becomes part of the moon spirit. It's a little bit unclear about what exactly the details are here, in the sense of like, is, you know, Tui is a being. We know spirits themselves are beings. So like, is there just two consciousness now in the moon spirit, and UA is a part of that? Or is she just the moon spirit and Tui actually, the personality, like, has actually died? That's where it gets a little bit unclear with this whole, like, this is one of the first times we've ever kind of seen something like this, like a spirit like splitting their energy off, and how exactly this all works. But it's a very intense emotional scene. Finally we sort of get the, you know, another Sokka UA kiss here. It's the kind of goodbye scene. This is the you made out with the moon spirit kind of scene here. And this is what brings the moon back and leads Zhao to his big sort of failure moment. But what are your thoughts on UA's sacrifice?
Yeah, no, it definitely is pretty, sort of emotional with everything, sort of the whole note of, Iroh saying that, she's been touched, and we noticed before from previous scenes that, she's already had this connection. And, I think for the most part, for most people, that was pretty obvious that, she had this connection with the moon spirit. She stands out as a unique character in general. So it definitely, is sort of, heartbreaking to see on Sokka, sort of this revelation that he does have to let her go. And yeah, like you mentioned, her whole idea of duty to her nation, her tribe, to her people, just in general, I think, something that, it hits home with what they're trying to say, at least for her and her character in here. So, she does sort of make the ultimate sacrifice. And it does seem that sort of like this was more, like we mentioned earlier, sort of just like a preset type of thing that was going to happen, based on just sort of her sort of, physical sort of like essence sort of essentially like disappearing, and really sort of, I don't know, maybe it's almost more sort of like a rejoin with the moon spirit rather than just sort of like it was always sort of like a separate thing to begin with. But yeah, definitely is, sort of heartbreaking on Sokka's side of things to see this.
Now, there is a bit of a weird thing, because of course we now know quite a bit about sort of like spirit mechanics, and as far as we're aware, Tui would have been reborn at a certain point later, because spirits can't truly die except maybe dark spirit bending. We don't really know how exactly that works. But in this case, even though there was a mortal form involved here with just the fish, we know from like Lady Tianhai that even if you die in that mortal form, you are still reborn, because fundamentally you are still a spirit. I think the implication here about why this is a much more kind of crazy situation is the importance to the physical world of it being the moon spirit, and however long it would have taken Tui to kind of reincarnate itself into a new kind of form, the world would have completely gone out of balance, in the same way that's what happened in like the Korra Book 2 finale type thing. That it was important to deal with this quickly to avoid the world being fundamentally changed forever. I think that's more of the situation at hand here. So, you know, yes, technically Twee would have been reborn eventually. I guess just not instantaneously is the main interpretation there. But do you have any thoughts on that, given that we learned that in, comics that occurred like way after this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess that is a point of note. I mean, also the whole idea of them sort of having these physical bodies, like when, spirit would have been reincarnated, reconstituted, would have been directly to a physical body or would have been to their true, sort of spiritual sense, which we don't even know what that is. Like, is that just like a pure energy being like we've seen with Rava and stuff like that, or would they come back to the same space? I mean, like you said, regardless the timing of how that is, especially if it's not like an instant thing, which if it was instant we probably would have seen it in this sort of short period of time here, that everything would have been out of whack, and that would have led to other things that even when the spirit did come back, it might not have even mattered at that point. So it definitely still holds weight for what happened, regardless of the eventuality of what might have actually, how the spirit might have actually came back.
Mm-hmm. And then the last stuff in the episode is kind of a wrap up on quite a lot of stuff. There's Paku is going to take the Northerners down south to help rebuild. Katara is going to be Aang's new master for the final little stage of him learning waterbending. Arnook talks to Sokka about how he was given a vision by the spirits that this would basically one day happen to Yue, and so he is sad. He's proud, but sad. And the reason he's not like distraught in a way in this case is because he knew that this would one day happen and has kind of prepared himself for that. The Iroh Zuko ending is that Zuko has made it out. We saw that he kind of broke out of the ropes earlier on. He is tired. Iroh advises him to take rest, and he finally takes that rest. And this is, meant to be this more bigger representative thing of he's not going to be, at least for the next while, hyper focused on going after Aang. And maybe with that focus not being everything, he'll realize, there's more to what he's about, what he's trying to do. And that's sort of what we see at the start of book 2, is thinking more about, is this what he wants? And that begins to change things. And then finally, Ozai gives Azula, Zuko's sister, a task, because he is now declared Iroh and Zuko traitors. So it's quite quick wrap up, but it's pretty kind of like good in terms of like Paku makes Katara a master, and all the other stuff is quite good. You maybe wish there was room for maybe another episode where we just got to hang out in the Northern Water Tribe for a little bit in the aftermath, but we move on, of course. But what are your thoughts on the final couple of wrap-up scenes here?
Yeah, I mean, I think they do a good job of, setting the stage without giving you too much information of what's going to happen, in the next season here, because we know there's still a lot of loose ends and things that have to be figured out, and things that haven't quite been, sort of fully understood as they are, in this world here. But, you get to see a bit of it, and it definitely, I think it does a good job of, making you interested in what's coming. I think even just, sort of the end scene with, new characters that we don't quite know, but we know they're related to the ones we currently have, I think does a really good job of, setting the stage.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that is the end of 120, the end of book 1. So we're through a full book of Avatar there. So we do have another episode though still to go, so we'll jump straight across to Korra and the first episode of book 2, Spirit's Rebel Spirit. I do think we need to have a little bit of a discussion just as we start book 2 here about the fact that this is the book in all of Avatar with probably the worst reputation in the fandom if you look at sort of like general opinions on the series. Now, if you've listened to the podcast or my YouTube channel for any length of time, you know that I really, really like book 2. It's actually my favorite book of Korra. And I think in general, most of the people we've had on the podcast over the years, we've never really, leaned in the direction of hating book 2. We've had people on who aren't the biggest fans of it, but I think the fandom does tend to over exaggerate how bad this is. So I'm excited to go through this again to just kind of highlight, there's some good stuff in here. It's not all like amazing, but there is some very good stuff, including this first episode. But Greg, what are your overall thoughts on sort of book 2, the way it's treated by the fandom and so on?
Yeah, no, it definitely does have overall sort of like the most sort of negative connotations towards it compared to any other seasons, which, some of it, you can understand where it sort of comes from, but I think, overall on a whole, it seems to be a lot more slanted than, people really wanted to be. And I don't know if that's more so just from sort of like a vocal minority speaking up about it, or about the changes that they did actually have to make in it in order for it to be produced in sort of times, which I think some of those notes that people have are sort of over exaggerated as well. So I don't know. I think for me personally, it doesn't really grate on my sort of sense of Avatar as a whole, that it like brings it down for me in terms of the whole overall series. Like there are any number of episodes per season that you could say that are just not as strong as the other ones, and those are pretty clear what those are, but it also has some of the coolest parts towards it that you can actually recommend to people who never even heard of Avatar, and they'll be like, oh, that was cool that was included, and it all comes from this sort of season here. So it should be interesting to see how it plays out when we go over
yeah,
it.
like my main thing with this is that like I'd never like argue the point that everyone in the fandom should view book 2 as being their favorite. My main defense of this is basically just to take it from being, people have their first, second, third favorite book of Korra, and then like there's 10 gap stages, and then they place book 2 like dead bottom, like it's not even close to the other book. My main argument would just be to bring it up within range of the other ones, that there's a discussion to be had with the other books as well, because I think with Avatar it's almost like boring to discuss which books are the best, because the opinion is the same across the board. Korra, though, I think a lot of fans have very different opinions on what the best books actually are, and just the sort of general fan opinion isn't even I think the representative of the fandom overall, because you can make a case for all of the books, in my opinion, that like we just went through book 1, which is super, super solid. There's not that many low moments, and I think people over exaggerate like the romance stuff, and beyond that there's not too much to complain about with book 1. And then with book 2, like we're going to discuss here, I think there's a lot of people in the fandom who have only ever watched this once when it aired, and haven't realized that like it's been 10 years and those opinions aren't like super great at the moment. And there's so much good stuff here. So let's get into this. So Rebel Spirit, we open up on. And for me, I've always liked this episode. And I've always had a habit, I think, with book 2 of like highlighting a couple of episodes that I think are really good and that I think fans also like. And I've maybe put this one on the lower end of things, but in more recent years, I kind of realized that actually this is a pretty good season opener. Like it includes pretty much all the characters, introduces new characters. It's a really good setup for most of the main plots in the book, and I think it does a really good job. I don't think there's many of the like major book 2 criticisms here, at least for me. I get that like a lot of the common fan criticisms maybe come from aspects of this episode, but we'll discuss that as we kind of go through it. But I like the premiere here for book 2. But what are your thoughts on the premiere of book 2 here?
Yeah, I think I think a lot of the beginnings to most of the seasons from either one of the shows, or in case for the Avatar episode for this week, the beginning of the two-parter does a pretty good job of, I guess, sort of setting the stage of where things are going, or what's sort of just previously happened here. So I think, for the most part, this episode, it plays out pretty well. Like it shows you the different points. It leads you towards what's going to happen. It has a good bit of, things that have happened in the previous season that are still developing or going to develop in sort of different ways. And it just lays that all out for you.
hmm So we open up, and this is interesting. Like, we have a 6 month time skip. They quickly cover in the kind of recap in a way what has happened. So big point based on book one is that we no longer have the council in Republic City. We have the United Republic with a president that has been elected by the people, and that is President Raiko. So he's here. We have the idea that Boomy has retired and now lives on Air Temple Island, so he's going to be part of the kind of cast now. And then we also have the more kind of plot setup that dark spirits are attacking ships in Southern Water Tribe waters. The kind of main plot setup. And this is probably one of the more valid criticisms here. It's that the transition from book one to book two is probably the one where it's maybe like the least smooth, or it's just very clearly we have ended an arc, we're starting a new arc, and the main kind of connection between the bits is just like we no longer have a bending council, we have a president who's a non-bender because there's more non-benders than benders, and that's meant to show quite a bit of progress, that we made a couple of changes in the city and this has fixed things, along with the fact that it seems like the police force is cracking more down on the triads, which was another one of the big problems for non-benders in the city. So there are kind of like solutions based on what Amon did, and it's like, okay, it's not everything. Is it the most like complicated explanation? Not really, but it seems to be progress, at least in the right direction. But what are your thoughts on our kind of like 6 month kind of recap here?
Yeah, that's a point to make. I mean, I don't know. I guess, sometimes you like sort of those epilogue type, recap things, and sometimes they sort of, might seem a bit lazy because there might have been other ways that you could have shown that as well. But considering, I guess, sort of how they wanted things to progress, it doesn't, I don't know. I mean, they sort of did that sort of scroll in the beginning where they sort of, had a recap of the previous series, right? But I guess maybe it makes more sense in that sort of regard because it's been a longer period of time compared to, say, just 6 months here. But I think in terms of, what they're trying to show in terms of things that have changed, it gets across the point that, progress, like you said, has been mentioned. It seems like it's pretty rapid progress, maybe than what you might sort of expect. But this is the city here, and they're more modern here, so we're supposed to show that things can proceed at maybe slightly more faster paced than what might have been happened in the past. So progress has definitely been made here. But it definitely plays into the aspects that we wanted to see, and I think it does a good enough job of just sort of setting up where they want things to go, and that even if things are moving forward, not everything's perfect.
Then we basically get a kind of like present day kind of like recap of like, okay, we're coming in 6 months later, where are all of our main characters? So we get a quick scene of a dark spirit pulling basically a ship underwater, one of these dark spirit attacks from a pretty large dark spirit. We get the fire ferrets losing to the rhino lines in pro bending, but we get the reveal that Bolin is now the team captain. There's no Mako or Korra on the team, and Bolin's two teammates are not very good, and so the team isn't very good, and they lose immediately. The fire ferrets are nowhere as a team. Mako is now a police officer working with Lin, making his way up the ranks, and we see him taking down some triad members in style, basically. So Mako's doing pretty well for himself. Asami is testing, I suppose, some non-military planes, hoping to sort of shift the direction of future industries and improve the reputation after what happened with Hiroshi. But we find out the company is nearly bankrupt and has a bad reputation. She's going to the Southern Water Tribe to get some business help from a businessman down there. And then with Korra, she's doing an air scooter race with the Air Kids on Air Temple Island. She uses the Avatar state to win. Tenzin doesn't like this, and we see that for her, things have kind of gone backwards a little bit. She thought things would be different after Amon and a lot of what happened in book one, but Tenzin has sort of gone straight back to just treating her like, he's just one of his kids. She still needs all this training, and not really giving her the respect that she sort of has wanted in all of this. And the plan is that they're going to go to the different air temples, but first they're going down south for the Glacier Spirits Festival. So that's the entire setup here at the start to establish where everyone is. So what are your thoughts, Greg, on where each of these characters is at the start?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, it definitely, for some of them, it seems like they're making headway in towards of, their overall goals, where other ones, it does, seem like maybe they've gone a little bit stagnant, maybe a little bit backwards in terms of, where they thought they might be at this point in time here. But I don't know, I like that they took the time to actually show this to all of us. And, some of these scenes are pretty cool, like Mako's, in style scene of, catching the triads is pretty cool here, the triple threats or whoever. And, it's, I don't know, I like the setup here that they have for everyone here. And I don't know, I think it definitely shows that we're going somewhere, and that, things are going to come to a head later on in the episode, in the season.
And then I will say also, we mentioned it in the start there, that people often criticize this episode and a lot of the early book 2 episodes from a production standpoint because they have a different animation studio here. A lot of these early scenes, I think, are very good. Like the Dark Spirit pulling the ship underwater, there's some pretty ambitious shots there. The Mako police chase is very dynamic and I think well done. Again, there's also, I think, decent incorporation of 3D stuff in some of these shots, with the planes and the motorbike and car, and then even the air scooter race. They do a good job as what is effectively your fill-in animation studio for 7 episodes. So, I find it difficult to overly criticize Studio Pierrot for what they've done here. Again, I think this is one of those kind of almost disingenuous criticisms from the fandom, where you'll see a lot of non-keyframe screenshots to make the animation look terrible, when that's never a good way to judge if the animation is actually good. When overall, I think the shots are quite nicely done. But what are your thoughts on the animation switch here going into the start of season 2?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think unless you're really, really looking for that sort of, difference, and you have that sort of eye for animation, that there's a pretty high chance that you might not even notice it in some regard. I mean, especially when things start moving and, things are happening in the action scenes that we see here. I mean, especially for these initial ones, I don't think if you're just sort of watching on the regular that's something that sort of stands out too much to you, because it all flows well. It looks cool. I mean, it definitely it's entertaining. It's still written well as a story, as well as you either like it or you don't like it. That doesn't sort of get to me personally as much as I think it's been made to stand out in the fandom. I'm sure if you pull frames from any season, whoever, regardless of who's actually producing the animation, you can see things that probably look kind of wonky. So yeah, that never really got to me per se. And this is a studio that has done animation for years. It's not like it's a new studio out of nowhere. So the fact that they're even able to jump onto it is pretty cool in that regard.
Yeah, and then I think a lot of people as well, a lot of people don't realize that Avatar: The Last Airbender has 3 separate animation studios as well. And you can sort of tell the difference between episodes done by specific animation studios. I think it's more noticeable with I think season 1, where the DR movie episodes are probably maybe some of the weaker animated episodes. But no one ever really brings that up that much, which is why it's always a bit of a weird thing where Korra has literally just 7-8 episodes done by a different animation studio, whereas half of Avatar is done by different animation studios other than JM Animation. So that's just one of those kind of things. But anyway, so we from there move on to the idea, okay, we're going to the Glacier Spirits Festival, so we're on the boat down to the Southern Water Tribe. Mako and Korra have a bit of a talk here. She's loving hearing about how action-packed Mako's kind of life is as a police officer, and wishes she could be kind of involved in the action like he is. But she only gets to train, and things seem to just be the same as they were in like early book one. She's very frustrated, and Mako doesn't really know what exact advice to kind of give her about, like, should he say that like Tenzin just cares for her, do what you think is best, let her make the decision. And you can see there's kind of some frustration. It's an interesting one where like they try to, I think, frame this as being like a Mako Korra problem, where I think it's more, as they go through this, more on just like Korra is very frustrated by the way her mentors and the people around her are kind of like directing her on what to do, and she's kind of taking it out on other people rather than like Mako really being a problem in the relationship here. But I like some of this early stuff here with Mako and Korra, where you see that they do get on very well and actually have a pretty good relationship. Again, they've been together for 6 months at this point, you'd expect that. But what are your thoughts on this Mako Korra scene?
Yeah, I think you definitely can see that they, generally have a good rapport with each other. Like there's, other than her sort of building sort of frustrations, which I guess, could say has happened over these last sort of 6 months, they generally get on, pretty well. It seems like this is maybe just coming to a point now where Korra is really sort of feeling the pressure of not really doing much. And, the only person that she's, open enough to talk to about these in any sort of regard is Mako. And he unfortunately gets sort of the brunt of her sort of unease in these situations, which, you can see that happens a couple times throughout the episodes here, as he sort of tries to navigate this whole sort of, relationship that he has with her. So it's definitely, something of note. And I think, along the lines you're saying, it definitely is more of a internal thing than an external thing with her personally at this point in time.
So we arrive at the south. We get to meet Kaya for basically the first time. I think at this point we had only seen like a tiny little image of Kaya's face on like a family tree type thing. So this is just kind of like meeting her for the first time. We get to see Tonraq and Senna again, of course, Korra's parents. But then the Northerners arrive. They're also coming to the festival. So we get to meet Unalaq, who is revealed to be Tonraq's brother. And just from that like couple second meeting of like Unalaq going up to him and being like, Tonraq, brother, and the shot that they have of them just looking at each other, everyone can tell that like there are some huge issues between these two. And you sort of wonder, like, whoa, what's going on here? Tonraq's brother is the chief of the North? What does this mean in terms of, like, the family connection situation? Eska and Desna are also introduced, the twins. And stuff like that is what I really like here, where, like, Unalaq is immediately introduced, and because he's, like, family to a bunch of the characters, including, like, the main character, he is straight away interesting because he's a world leader, waterbender, and he's like connected to Tonraq's story and all these other characters as well straight away. So I like what they do here straight away, because this is the dynamic of this episode. It's that Tenzin and Tonraq are, for the most part, like kind of controlling what Korra is doing as the Avatar. And here is Unalaq arriving in to sort of like put a wedge in the middle of that and try and change this dynamic. And I think it works very well over the course of the episode. But what are your thoughts on the big meeting here with Unalaq?
Yeah, no, you definitely get the sense that something is just not on the up and up between the two of them. And we don't get the full story for a little bit in the season here, but I think they definitely make it seem pretty, I guess, sort of like imposing that there's definitely some strife here, that everyone seems sort of like awkward at this, like no one really seems to know. Like it really makes me wonder how they did like transition to the next scene where they're like all sort of like walking together in the festival, because it definitely just seems like this would have been like really, really just an awkward situation overall. But I think that's the point of it, and it does a really good job of that, because it definitely seems like it does a quick 180 from them being happy that they landed and everything like that, and Mako meeting Rock to just being this is just a weird situation to be in.
So Unalaq immediately begins to complain about how the South has like lost all of its spirituality and sense of tradition. That the festival seems like more of a how to people like eating as much as possible than anything related to the spirits. He does also note in front of Korra that sailors are being attacked in southern waters, and basically alluding to the idea that like if we were still following the traditions, maybe things might be different and these attacks wouldn't be coming in, the spirits wouldn't be angry at what's happening. Korra, of course, is shocked to hear that, why am I only hearing about this now after like multiple attacks have come in? I'm the Avatar, I'm meant to deal with stuff like this. And it's obviously, they basically say that like the reason she doesn't know is because Tenzin and Tonraq have kept this information from her. So, and again, the wedge being put in between Korra and her current like mentors, basically, and he immediately offers to teach Korra how to be basically like truly spiritual, like the real ways of spirituality in the water tribes. And she's straight away interested because I think she gets the sense from him that he's respecting her as the Avatar. He walks up and straight away calls her Avatar, whereas like Tenzin and Tonraq don't really in any way give her kind of that respect for her kind of position. And you can see that kind of he is just in the way he's treating her, giving her something very different than her current mentors. And it's like a not super obvious manipulation, but it's subtle and kind of fitting, I think, for Unalaq as a character. But what are your thoughts on this scene here with Unalaq?
Yeah, it definitely does fit his character. I mean, it's all towards his eventual end goal, right? But for what he wants to achieve, and it seems like he can already sort of sense the discontent that Korra is having with her, current mentors, as you say, and it just sort of, plays on her idea of, sort of being more active and involved in things. Like, one, no, she didn't notice she was being withheld this information, and two, something that she can actually like do. Like, Korra is still of the mindset that she wants to do things. Like, she's still being more active. Like, the earlier example of, what she considers airbending is punch, punch, punch with, the sort of airstrikes and stuff. So this seems, even if it is a spiritual thing, which we know, Korra hasn't really been, super keen on sort of spiritual matters, it's, an active spiritual thing. And that's something that I think she can sort of grasp on a little bit more so than if it was just purely just sort of, communing with the spirits and sort of meditation and those sort of long lines, which, just sort of shows where, she's at in her character development, which is, pretty much what, Unalaq is playing off of, with, sort of his, I guess you could say, like you're saying, slight manipulation of the situation at hand.
Because it is interesting in that, like, he's just coming in with the truth here. Now, you know eventually that, well, why are these spirits actually dark? He did it, of course. So he is causing this situation, but he's just telling the truth, and it's like, why haven't you told her? She is the Avatar. Any other Avatar would have been told. And is making very obvious points where she doesn't see this as manipulation. Tenzin and Tonraq kind of do, but she views it, because she already has issues with them, as just being like, you just don't like him because like he's better than you type thing. And you can just see that he's using the fact that he is giving her exactly what they aren't as like to his advantage. But anyway, next scene, we get Asami bringing Bolin to the meeting with Varric, who is the Southern Water Tribe businessman. And she's a bit worried about like, just don't talk much, I'll do most of the talking. But Bolin kind of gets himself, he thinks, into a bad situation, but that actually opens up the door to Varric being absolutely willing to work with Asami. He likes that Asami has chosen as her assistant this like straight shooter, as he calls him, even though Bolin hasn't actually done anything that impressive. But he's managed to win Varric over here, and so Asami basically gets what exactly she wants. They're then shown movers for the first time, so this is kind of cinema basically in Avatar for the first time, and the first mover is an ostrich horse walking. Now, I think there is some stuff with Varric where later on he reveals that he had like an ostrich horse when he was younger. I'm not sure if it's fully connected that this is of that same ostrich horse, but it's an interesting little note there. But this is sort of important again because Varric is key to a couple of the plots, especially early on in this book. But yeah, what are your thoughts on the debut of Varric as a character?
Yeah, it definitely stands out as one of those like sort of character introductions that's sort of, I guess you can tell that they're like an oddball, they're unique, that they're going to be one of those sort of fun characters that, actually seems like he has more of a role than, some of the other sort of, throwaway sort of, one-off sort of funny characters that we've seen. So I don't know. I like his introduction here. I think it works well for what they're trying to do here. And, you can see sort of Bolan's sort of interaction with him and, how that might become something in the future or maybe not. But, we do know that it's something, they have this sort of dynamic that sort of develops over time here, and it all helps towards Asami's sort of end goal of trying to sort of rebuild her company and stuff.
And what's interesting is that Varric is ultimately a villain in this book, but he's introduced as being this complete like comedy character, and you're almost, I think, even further like moved away from considering him a threat because Unalaq is kind of like basically like the likes of Varric are representative of like the loss of spirituality in the South, and he's just some crazy businessman who doesn't care about anything, and you're just like, oh, why would I ever suspect him of being like behind everything? But it's almost this like subtle setup of like there is a bit of a kind of Varric Unalaq conflict throughout all of this with some of the kind of rebellion kind of plots that actually kind of starts up here, and the whole war profiteering thing that Varric ultimately tries to do. But anyway, from there we get to the feast in honor of, like, I suppose, Unalaq's arrival, and he gives just a speech to the well, he talks to Korra. He mentions how like the elders in the past would commune with spirits like directly, how like the southern lights were still around and the spirits would dance in the skies, and that, Korra is the bridge as the Avatar. He would really like to teach her to kind of be more spiritual. And again, he's talking to her more personally here. And again, you can sort of see like Tenzin and Tonraq glancing over at it, not liking that this is happening. And as they do that, the confrontation happens. He again puts another wedge in between the two of them and is like, oh yeah, did you know basically that like the reason your training had to take place all on its own in the compound, why you didn't get to do things like the other past avatars, is because it was actually Tenzin and Tonraq who made that decision, whereas Korra basically reveals that she was always told that Aang had made this decision that avatars, the next avatar should be kind of kept more protected more. And so Korra is even more furious at her father and Tenzin than she was before. And again, this is the truth of something that has actually happened. Now, admittedly, with this one, we get a further reveal in book 3 about the full scope of the situation, but still, that's a pretty bad lie, and I think to include Aang in it is almost makes it even worse. So, what are your thoughts on this reveal here?
Yeah, I think, using something in the previous Avatar's name that really isn't, they don't really have anything to do with, is probably like a bad look regardless of the situation, but especially for a Korra, that just, speaks to all the sort of wrong, doing that, she wouldn't really want to have to deal with here. So yeah, no, I think that's definitely, and it stands out. It's just, like you're saying, he's speaking to her on sort of like her level, or, a respectful level, that really sort of connects with her, and the fact that, it's just, they're all true things, even if they are, manipulations, and he's had pretty much a hand in all of these situations from the get-go. It just sort of, it's all building on and on towards, what his goals are, and, kind of what Korra wants in the end as well, is just someone who's really going to sort of respect her and be more active in her actual training of things. And she really, as of now, she's really all about that. She really just doesn't like all the sort of passiveness that has been happening for the last 6+ months.
And yeah, she likes the idea that he is actually giving her a little bit of respect, putting all these kind of things to kind of highlight how bad her current mentors actually are. But also for Unalaq, he at this point in his overall plan, his villainous plan, he does honestly need to make Korra more spiritual. So this is sort of the section where, like, even though he is still fundamentally manipulating the situation, he does have to actually teach her to be spiritual, because she's not particularly outside of just the fact that she's the Avatar. So this episode, I think especially the next one, 202, is an important episode in terms of, again, he actually teaches her some good stuff that gets utilized in, like, the finale. So you get to see a little bit of, like, this is part of, like, Unalaq without the villainous aspect, but with some of it as well. So you get a glimpse of maybe who he was before, and you see that from his, like, speech, what he says, like, next, when he stands up and just talks to the South and says, "I'm saddened to see what it has become, a cheap carnival that celebrates greedy and trivial humans. I feel the time is fast approaching when the North can no longer stand idly by while our Southern brothers slip into total spiritual decay. Angry spirits are already attacking ships in your waters. I only hope we are not too late to change course." And the response from the crowd is just kind of like a couple of, like, murmurs. Like, no one has much of a reaction to what is, like, a pretty serious kind of reveal and, like, criticism of the South. It's probably, like, Tonrock who actually has, like, the most severe reaction to this, because he's basically saying, like, the North will have to do something about the South, and this is how he feels, that he doesn't like that half of the Water Tribe basically isn't spiritual in any way anymore, and he wants people to be more spiritual, because he does sort of ideally, I suppose, imagine a world where spirits can be part of the world. He kind of wants spirits to be more a part of the world normally. He's already gone a little bit too far with that, but you can sort of see what he's trying to get at here, that this is stuff that we know can actually happen, because we've seen this much more directly in, like, say, now the Kyoshi books, the Karuk backstory, the Yang Chen books, that, okay, Unalaq has manipulated this spirit attack, but this is the sort of stuff that can happen from lack of respect for the spirits, which is, I think, interesting to note. But what are your thoughts on his speech?
Yeah, no, his speech is pretty, like, out there, like, considering what eventually does happen. Like, it seems pretty ominous what he's sort of instigating that's happening in the South, and what him essentially will have to do in the near future here. And yeah, there really isn't much of a response there. Like, but I mean, really, what would you really say, unless you had, like, a strong sort of, like, rebuttal, like, no, it doesn't matter or anything like that, which is sort of what Tom Rock's been trying to say before, the whole idea of, like, tradition change, things change, which, from his perspective, things sort of had to change for them to be the way that they currently are. But it definitely is, it's like, almost a little bit short of, the real threat that actually does happen later on there. But yeah, it's pretty serious there. And, just, it makes you sort of think about the situation at hand here, which, it may, make people who are there think about it, but it doesn't seem like, the South at large is really sort of, I guess, sort of cognizant of that sort of situation that's ongoing there. But it's definitely an issue to be had.
And that is what is interesting about, like, Tonrock and all of this. Like, when you factor in the whole idea that, like, again, his banishment was ultimately manipulated by his brother, but Tonrock is not very spiritual and is basically borderline, like, anti-spiritual in, like, these early episodes. And so when he's saying these things, like, next to Korra, who is, like, an inherently spiritual person by being the Avatar, you can see where like the problem actually is that, like you said, like traditions change. It's like, okay, that's understandable in some situations here, but in this case, it does just feel like a defense for why they're not spiritual, and it's not really much of a point. But we move on and we get but basically the start of Bolin and Eska's very very odd relationship that happens throughout this book. So it's just he goes up, tries to start a conversation with her. We see that those two have a pretty unusual way of kind of discussing and interpreting things, and more as like a sort of point of like curiosity. Eska's sort of like, okay, let's see how this goes. This will be interesting to sort of like analyze and monitor. And again, sort of, she claims like Bolin as her own here, and he's like, what have I gotten myself in for? And we'll see more of this as we go on. I think Eska and Desna are quite fun as characters. And I like ultimately where we get to them across the seasons. Maybe you wish they'd done a couple more serious things with them along the way, but they do a decent, I think, like relationship with their father kind of arc in this situation. Those two coming to see sense, and then the relationship. It's very weird what they do with it over the course of the season, but they manage to make you care about it a little bit at the end, and then they're kind of reasonable about it as well. So, I think they ultimately managed to use this stuff quite well. But your thoughts on the start of this relationship?
Yes, it's definitely an odd one here, and even Bolin, who's kind of like oblivious to things, sees sort of the questioning of this sort of situation that he's found himself in here. So yeah, I think they do use them pretty well. I think they stand out as those unique characters that like they're usually used for laugh, but they're not all laughs. Like they do have a good bit of seriousness and sort of sternness to themselves. Depending on this sort of situation, it's almost sort of like awkward, funniness that they have to them, which I think, works well. It's this nice sort of comedy bit. So it's interesting to see in this episode that, we get introduced to two sort of, funny type characters, ones that are like, Varric that's like sort of intentionally funny, and ones that are sort of like, just because of their personalities seem to be sort of fun type of characters.
Mm-hmm. We get another Mako kind of Korra scene here where we kind of do like the reverse of the first scene, where he tried to give her like some basic advice. She didn't like it. Here she airs her frustrations, and he kind of tries to just be like, whatever you think is the best, and she doesn't quite kind of like that advice. But again, you get the sense here, like what she says in this one is that like Tenzin just thinks of me as another one of his kids, which I think is very telling, given that like Tenzin's arc this book is basically about like kind of his relationship with his own siblings, his own kids, and like in the case of like Jinora, like accepting that there are some things that she's better than him at, and that his relationship with Korra has to be a bit different than the others. He can care about her in that way in certain ways, but he needs to stop kind of treating her as like a trainee kind of really at this point. So Korra is like kind of correct in the way that she talks about this here. Like there's good and bad to that, and that it shows he cares for her, but it probably goes a bit too far, and it's still in the kind of very kind of protective kind of mold of kind of like a mentor. Given that like she technically doesn't really do much more airbending training, or she does it's off screen. So you can sense like he's maybe being a bit like overly critical, that like, no, you haven't mastered it yet, but she effectively kind of had. But as a kind of secondary scene with Mako Korra, I quite like this one, as she points out the kind of core issue, at least with Tenzin. What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think she's this is just another point where she's getting towards like her sort of frustration levels, and it's interesting how you see that sort of visually with the sort of carnival game that they're playing, and sort of her winning with sort of the extra juice from her sort of situation that she's currently in here. So I like that they have that sort of visual aspect to it here. But yeah, I think another situation where Mako's trying his best to sort of work in the situation, but it's just not quite working in the relationship, at this point in terms of his sort of avatar advisement role here. But yeah, I think, she does bring up some good points that, maybe she's, being a bit too much protected, which, we know that there's more towards that story, and there's a whole reason why she was, or why they set up the sort of compound in that sort of situation. But, they're not really explaining that to her. So maybe this could have all been, averted if they did, sort of come on the level with her a little bit more with the situation at hand, rather than, just trying to sort of hide everything away from her.
Yeah, and then there's also the point of like she's kind of like she's 18 at this point. Like, when was this going to like end? And like they actually do let her kind of be the Avatar. And like again, given that she's already had the whole season 1 adventure thing going on, she makes the point that like I got through that, I dealt with that. It's already a bad kind of note that you're not telling me about like key world events I probably should know about. And it gets into a little bit kind of further than that, where like even when she starts to meet some of the world leaders in this book, they also don't really respect her, and that adds to her frustration and what's going on. But in this episode, we get the dark spirit attack. So this is the kind of rebel spirit basically that comes in. And we see that it just comes in, starts to attack. The Benders are really no match for this thing at all, because this is kind of one of our first times we've really seen a fight of Benders against a spirit. And like they can't do anything. It just kind of is darting around the place because it's like an inhuman. It's not even like a physical kind of thing really. Even Tonrock comes in. He gets defeated. Tenzin attempts to talk to the spirit, but he just gets, smacked aside. Korra tries to use the Avatar state, and she does kind of pummel the spirit for a little bit, but isn't able to kind of do enough to kind of subdue it. It grabs her. She looks like she's in a bit of trouble when Unalaq arrives in and calms the spirit down by using this very interesting water bending technique where he creates like a kind of helix spiral around it and sort of like borderline like hypnotizes it and turns it into like gold light, and it's light again, and he says go in peace. It's obviously the debut here of spirit bending, and it's for Korra, this is an incredible thing, like a technique that you can use to kind of like deal with spirits. And having just seen, for instance, like her father fail with attacking a spirit, Tenzin failing to talk to a spirit, here is someone who just came in and expertly dealt with this wild spirit situation that no one else had any idea what to do in. He has proven he has what she wants, basically. And he again says, I can teach you to do stuff like this if you want. And this is a key scene here because, Tonrock and Tenzin just had a bit of a bad run of things there. And they immediately tried to sort of be like, no, Unalaq, you stay out of this. Tenzin's like, she still has much to learn with me. And Unalaq's like, no, she doesn't. She's not going to learn anything going to the air temples. Tonrock is also kind of like, no. But for him, it's more of almost his own issues with his brother coming into play rather than any particular reason Korra shouldn't at least learn something from him. And so it highlights the idea that they're, again, stepping in to try and make her decisions for her. She rightly points out that, like, I'm right here, It's kind of weird to see you both arguing why I can't learn something from him when he just solved the situation. And she makes her choice at this point. Unalaq is going to be her mentor, and she has to basically take a break away from her current two mentors. And some of the dialogue here is a little kind of harsh, perhaps, but I think with the way the arcs ultimately go, this is what needed to happen, because the net result of this is that I think all three characters here, Korra, Tonrock, and Tenzin, all learn from their arcs where they sort of like kind of separate from each other. And again, I know people like to criticize Korra for being a little bit kind of hard to like in certain scenes with how she conducts herself, but it is partly like, or I think quite a lot of it comes down to the way Tenzin and Tonrock, treat her, basically. So I've always like sided with kind of Korra in this, while still acknowledging that she, you know, can be a bit frustrating in some of these scenes, but I lean more on her side than thinking that like she's just insufferable this season. So I've always liked a lot of these scenes and what they do, where the arc that they're going on is, because literally next episode, look at what they do with Tonrock. Look at where they get to with Tenzin by the time we get to the finale. Those two characters grow to realize what they need to be as her mentor. But what are your thoughts on this big spirit attack scene?
Yeah, I mean, I think the attack itself is pretty like impactful. Like you can see, like you said, how outmatched they are, and the fact that like is able to step in. I think it's another instance of just Korra being able to see something actually being done. Like at this point, like we mentioned before, she's still very much a do it type of character, and this seems like something that she can do. Which granted, there's a couple steps to her actually getting to that point, and she's not immediately doing all that, but it's still something that she can see that isn't sort of her being sort of like stuck in the mud with airbending training, which to her she thinks she's already sort of mastered enough. As well as just sort of, being able to sort of, actually have a mentor that actually sort of, seems to understand her, or, understands where she wants to go in her sort of, development as an avatar, which from what she currently understands, Tenzin and her father haven't quite done that yet. Like she's still sort of stuck being super protected and still hasn't really, done anything. Like she hasn't traveled the world as, Unalaq has mentioned before. So it's just, sort of showing the progress of where things are, and where, all of our characters definitely need to sort of grow and sort of mature a bit more. I mean, I think, you could see, sort of at the end of this, like, when Tenzin, is leaving, he sort of, bows and sort of does, it's been proud to like sort of serve your avatar. So that's sort of one of the few times where we've heard him use that sort of cadence with Korra, which you get the impression that hasn't been used recently, even if it was used near the end of the last season. So it definitely shows that all of our characters here, like you said, definitely need to sort of grow in the change in their sort of new dynamics that they have with each other in terms of their relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because one of the big reveals with Tenzin that happens later on in the season is just that he's not actually spiritual. Like, he, from like a kind of scholarly point of view, knows quite a bit of spiritual stuff, but he himself is not actually spiritually like inclined. And so he was just kind of hoping that stuff in the temples would just sort of unlock and help Korra to unlock the spiritual side to herself. Now, to be fair, like Korra obviously is taking the mentorship with Unalaq more from the perspective of like, teach me that technique to deal with spirits, rather than I truly want to be a more spiritual person. And it's really only sort of through the learning about the Wan backstory and the significance of like everything that happened along the way, her own trip to the spirit world later in this book, that she truly gets all of that in place. But I think she has to have some of these more kind of moments where she actually gets to do spiritual stuff before that can happen. And that's why like this Unalaq kind of situation here is the right kind of way to go about things, because you could make the argument that if she went to the air temples, maybe the Jinora being revealed as the true spiritual one would have still happened, and they could have still made that happen. But I think for Tenzin almost to be open to that being the dynamic, he needs to have the kind of rejection from Korra here to realize that, oh yeah, I actually don't handle a lot of these things all that well. Because the next scene is I think quite interesting. In the aftermath of basically being dismissed by Korra, he is heading off for the air temples with pretty much just his family, not including Bumi and Kaya, and has to be basically like convinced by Katara to take his brother and sister with him, and that you need to bring them with you. They are your family. And he's kind of reluctantly does it, and is just like, okay, we'll see how this goes. And we see that, he I think grows as a character quite a lot from just having these interactions with Bumi and Kaya, and then realizing he probably also needs to try a bit more with his own kids, and then eventually later on in the book change his approach with Korra as well. So again, like I love Korra's arc this book, but the Tenzin arc is also like really, really strong when we get there, which is why the finale stuff is so fantastic, like between the two of them. And I think it only works because you actually have this quite harsh kind of like almost breakup style scene between mentor and apprentice here. And so, stuff like this is why it works so well, that Unalaq, through basically just subtle manipulations and telling the truth, has gotten Korra where he wants. But it's also set up a lot of these arcs as well. So what are your thoughts on the kind of final scene here, more on the Tenzin side of things?
Yeah, no, it is a subtle manipulation. I mean, I don't even know. I mean, it's subtle from what we currently see here, but it's really well orchestrated sort of overall here. But yeah, I think definitely, it definitely just sort of highlights that, a lot of our characters, besides the more sort of obvious ones like Korra, have a bit of, maturing to do, and that, they really don't quite realize everything that they have in front of them. And, with Unalaq being sort of thrown into the mix in this episode and this season overall, it really sort of, puts, sort of a line there where they're sort of realizing what they've been doing, or, maybe what they've been doing in the past quite hasn't been sort of the right way about going about things. And it's something that they have to sort of, essentially learn on their own before they can sort of come back together, like you say, and it really sort of makes it more impactful when things do work out for everyone in the end.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, there is our review for K201 Rebel Spirit. Next time out, when we do the rewatches, we'll be doing one episode of each. So we'll be doing the Southern Lights on the Korra side of things, and then the Avatar State on the Avatar side of things. So this will be followed, though, afterwards with a couple more, I think, kind of 3-episode ones as we make our progress through this. But I think the way I have it worked out is that a lot of the triple episode stuff is like there'll be a couple more after that, and then it does leave like a lot of the second half of like both series as just episodes where there'll be only 2 episodes. I think that's the way I have it organized. But we are making progress once again as we wait for news. But that has been episode 256 of the Avatar Online podcast. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye-bye.